An 8-year-old boy drowned while diving for a crab. He wanted to feed his mother who hadn't eaten in 3 days, and for 500 years, he lay nameless on a foreign island where no one came to tell anyone his name, until a dead forensic anthropologist from Chicago washed up on that island, one who knows how to read bones. But let's go back a few hours. The cold hits Daniel Song's face like a bucket of ice-cold water. He opens his eyes. 2 moons hang above him. One is white, the other is the color of old bone. He's lying face down in the wet sand. His mouth tastes of salt and ash. He inhales and starts coughing so hard that he rolls onto his side. His hand twitches toward his right side, where the knife had entered between his 6th and 7th ribs. His fingers find a smooth, pink scar. An old one, a long-healed one, but he remembers how the blade slid between the bones. He remembers it like a pro, because even as he was dying in the parking lot outside the coroner's lab, he managed to note the angle of entry and the depth. 10 years of working with the dead won't let go, even when you yourself become dead. He sits down, shakes the dirt off his palms, and freezes. Bones lie all around him, stretching to the horizon. Not piles, not a dump, rows. Neat, endless rows of human remains. The ribs are laid out in parallel. The skulls are face up. The femurs are lined up lengthwise. Everything has been bleached by the wind and sun to a sterile whiteness. Like specimens on a lab table, only the table stretches for kilometers. Panic surges from his stomach to his throat. Daniel suppresses it. Panic is a luxury. Panic is a waste of time. Instead, autopilot kicks in. He assesses the area, estimates the density. At least 40,000 remains, of varying ages, arranged ritually, oriented north and south. This isn't a cemetery. Cemeteries aren't this neat. This is a catalog, an archive. He stands up. His knees are shaking. His body, and yet not his own, at the same time. Younger, lighter, but with the same calluses on his fingertips, from thousands of hours of working with bones. The wind is blowing from the west. It carries salt and the Swedish rot of seaweed. That means the sea is nearby. An island. He's on an island. And Daniel does what he always does. He approaches the nearest skeleton. He crouches down. He runs his finger along the brow ridge. A man. About 45 years old. A lifetime of hard physical labor. Right-handed. A healed clavicle fracture. It healed crooked. Without a doctor. Daniel speaks softly. Hello. My name is Daniel. What was your name? And the phalanges of the skeleton's right hand twitch. It's not the wind. It's not the earth trembling. The bones are trying to clench, as if someone had heard him. Daniel doesn't pull his hand away. He's been talking to the dead for 10 years. He believed that every skeleton has a name, and his job is to restore that name. The only difference is that before, the dead were silent. He places his palm on the skull, and the world explodes. A torrent floods his mind. Not words, sensations. A dull ache in his lower back from working at an angle. Calluses from the wooden handle. The heat of red-hot metal. This man stood at the blacksmith's forge. For decades. A left-hander from birth who was forcibly retrained. As a child, someone tied his left hand to his body. And Daniel senses the name. He doesn't hear it. He feels it. As if it had always lain within these bones, waiting for someone to read it. Haldi. His name was Haldi. A weaponsmith. He died of a fever. Alone. On the cold floor, thinking about an unfinished order, Daniel pulls his hand away. He's shaking. Not from fear, from sensory overload. 2 days' worth of data on the remains flooded his brain with a single touch. 40,000 sets of remains all around. 40,000 names. 40,000 stories compressed into calcium and phosphorus, and he's the only one who can read them. Barefoot, unarmed, without food. He takes a breath and moves on to the next one. The second skeleton is a woman, around 50, wide pelvis, multiple births, feet deformed from standing for long periods. Daniel places his hand on it. Mira, a midwife. She delivered 12 other people's children. She had none of her own. She died in her sleep. Didn't even wake up. He moves on. The third skeleton hits him like a sledgehammer. Small, a child's, 8 years old, thin bones, malnourished. Harris's lines on the shin, several bouts of starvation in a short life. Daniel drops to his knees. He places both palms on the bones. Koren, 8 years old, drowned. His lungs filled with water as he dived for a crab. For his mother, because she hadn't eaten in 3 days. He wanted to feed her. Tears flow of their own accord. Hot. Angry. Daniel cries not because the world is mad, not because the bones are moving. He cries because an 8-year-old boy drowned for a crab and lay there for 500 years without a name, and no one ever came and told him his name. Daniel sits there for half an hour. Then he wipes his face. He stands up and says aloud, "Koren, you were 8. You drowned because you loved your mother. I've read you." And the little skeleton glows, dimly, gently. The bones lose their density. They become transparent. They dissolve. They are absorbed into Daniel's palm like water into dry earth. He feels it instantly. His lungs expand. His ribs spread apart. Air flows deeper than ever before. He can hold his breath. 7 minutes. He just knows it. Just like knowing how to walk. The boy who used to dive for crabs could hold his breath better than anyone in the village. And now that skill lives on in Daniel. Not magic. Not a gift. A legacy. Left behind by a child who had waited 500 years to be called by name. Daniel stares at the empty space. The sand is slightly warmer. He says, "Thank you." The sun is setting. A bone-white moon is rising. Daniel stands in the field of the dead, barefoot, hungry, with wet eyes, with the skill of a starving boy in his chest, and with a simple understanding. This world runs on bones, and he is the only one who knows how to read them. Night fell quickly on the island, without twilight, without a gentle transition. The sun dropped below the horizon like a stone into water. Darkness engulfed the field of bones in a matter of minutes. Daniel sat on the sand, leaning his back against a large boulder, the only rock within a 100-meter radius. There was nothing to eat, nothing to drink either. There was no dew. The air was dry and warm. It smelled of salt and old bone, a familiar scent like a lab. Only in the lab could he always walk over to the water cooler and pour himself some water. There was no water cooler here. He tried to organize what he knew. First, he died. A knife. A parking lot. Darkness. Second, he's alive. A different body. Younger. Healthier. But his. Third, he's on an island. Fourth, the bones around him aren't just bones. They contain information. And he knows how to extract that information. Fifth, absorption is working. Koren, 7 minutes without air. That's already quite a lot. Sixth, there are 2 moons. So this isn't Earth. He paused. He looked at the bone moon. He said aloud, "All right, accepted." The sound of his own voice in the silence was strangely soothing. Like in the lab when he worked alone on the night shift and muttered a report on the remains into the voice recorder. A habit. A routine. An anchor. Daniel closed his eyes. He tried to fall asleep. He couldn't. Not because of fear. Because of the sounds. The island wasn't silent. Somewhere far away there was a knocking, rhythmic, as if bone were striking bone. And even farther away, a rustling, thousands of tiny movements, as if the field around him were stirring in its sleep. He opened his eyes. He looked closely, and he saw it, on the horizon, far away. Something was moving, lots of things. White silhouettes in the moonlight, skeletons, dozens of them. They were walking. Not toward him, past him. Slowly, aimlessly, like sleepwalkers. Some dragged their feet, others crawled. Still others simply stood there, swaying. The undead. That word came from books and movies. Daniel looked at the procession with a professional eye. Varying degrees of preservation. Some were missing limbs. One walked without a skull. Another carried someone else's pelvic bone under his arm. Like a briefcase. It would have been funny if it hadn't been so scary. Daniel didn't move. He didn't breathe. He just watched. An hour passed. 2. The procession continued moving through the zone. Not a single skeleton turned toward him. Not a single one slowed down. As if Daniel were invisible. No. Not invisible. Empty. He remembered touching Haldi. How a flood of information had rushed into his head. He'd felt something else back then too. A background, a noise, a vibration, as if every bone on the field was humming at a specific frequency. Resonance, some kind of energy. And he didn't have that energy. Not at all. He was silent, empty, a blank slate for these bones. And the undead passed him by as if he were a rock. Daniel allowed himself to exhale. Before dawn, he dozed off after all. He woke up to the sun on his face. His mouth was parched. His tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth. Water. He needed water. He got up and headed west, toward the scent of the sea. 20 minutes later, he reached the shore. Rocky. Jagged. Gray waves crashed below. Seawater. Salty, undrinkable. But puddles glistened among the rocks. Tidal pools. He bent down. Tasted it. Salty. But in one of the upper pools, a small one, far from the surf line, the water was almost fresh. Rainwater. Collected in a hollow in the rock. He drank it all. 1.5 sips. It wasn't much, but enough to think. Clams. There were clams on the rocks, small ones, about the size of a thumbnail. He pried a few out. He ate them raw. They tasted like rubber soaked in ocean water. It didn't matter. Calories are calories. Daniel sat down on a rock. He looked out at the sea. Nothing on the horizon. No land, no ships, just gray water stretching to the very edge of the world. He turned and looked at the island. From this vantage point, the whole picture was laid out before him. Cordrain. He didn't know that name yet, but he could see its shape. The island was elongated, stretching from north to south, 5 kilometers long and 2 kilometers wide. Most of it was a field of bones, even, flat, covered in sand and remains. In the north, the field rose into a low hill, a burial mound. In the south, it dropped off into cliffs. To the east, something dark was visible. Sinkholes in the ground, caves or catacombs. To the west, where he was sitting now, was the shore, rocky, with puddles, with shellfish. Daniel mentally drew up a plan. First, find a reliable source of water, dew, rain, condensation. Second, food, shellfish, maybe seaweed, maybe something grows on the island. Third, shelter. The nights were warm, but it would rain. It definitely would. Fourth, safety. The undead were ignoring him for now, but the word "for now" made him nervous. Fifth, information. Bones. He needed more data. He returned to the field and walked to the western edge. The skeletons here were different. Smaller, thinner, women's, children's, the elderly. Not warriors, ordinary people. He crouched down. He touched the first skeleton. A woman, 60 years old, a weaver. Her fingers were twisted from working with threads. She died of exhaustion. A name came to him, faint and distant. Anish. He touched the next one, a man, 22 years old, a fisherman, drowned during a storm. Toba, another one, a woman, 30, a blacksmith's wife. Not the blacksmith's wife, a blacksmith herself, powerful forearms, burns on her knuckles, died in childbirth. Vilda, name after name, story after story. By noon, Daniel had read 26 skeletons. He absorbed only one, an old man named Tarn, 71 years old, a dew-gatherer. On the arid islands, it was a real profession, a man who could find water by its scent, by the color of a stone, by the behavior of insects, by the way the sand lay at dawn. Tarn had been doing this for 50 years. Daniel named him. Tarn, the dew-gatherer, 71 years. You knew where the water was hiding better than anyone else on your island. The bones glowed, dissolved, soaked in. And Daniel raised his head, sniffed the air. A wind from the northeast. The humidity was slightly higher in that direction. Between the burial mound and the eastern ravines, there must be a spring there, or at least a spot where condensation collects every morning. He knew it. He just knew. Just as Tarn had known his whole life. Daniel stood up. He dusted off his knees. He said quietly, "Thank you, Tarn." He headed northeast. An hour later, he found what he'd sensed. A shallow hollow between two rocky ridges, sheltered from the wind. Condensation gathered here in the morning. Drops glistened on the rocks. He licked them up with his tongue. He collected maybe half a glass's worth, but the main thing was that he'd found a place. He could live here, sort of. By evening on the second day, Daniel had set up something like a camp. He found a flat rock. He dragged an armful of dry seaweed from the shore. He placed 3 large shells next to it to collect dew. He sat down. He ate another handful of shellfish, and he pulled something out of his pocket that he shouldn't have had. A pencil stub. Short. Worn down. He didn't remember having a pencil when he was dying, but the pencil was in his pants pocket, the very pants he'd been wearing when he woke up. Daniel twirled it between his fingers. He looked at the flat stone and began to write. A list. Haldi. Gunsmith. Left-handed. Fever. Mira. Midwife. 12 births. In a dream. Corin. 8 years old. Drowned. Crab. Devoured. Tarn. Dew-gatherer. 71. Devoured. 26 names. 26 stories. With a pencil stub on a flat stone. The first page of his archive. On the third day, people fell from the sky. Daniel was sitting by his hollow, counting his shellfish supply. He heard a sound. A low hum. A vibration in the air. He looked up and saw a ship. An airship. He didn't know what else to call it. A wooden hull. Copper plating on the bottom. 4 sails made of something translucent. And it was flying. The ship hovered over the northern part of the island. High up. 100 meters. The hatch opened. Figures tumbled out. 4 of them. One after another. No parachutes. No ropes. They were simply pushed out. The ship immediately began to gain altitude. It headed southwest. It disappeared in 5 minutes. Daniel was already running. Tarn's skill guided him between the rocky ridges. Ko's skill. Renee's skill gave him lungs that never tired. 4 bodies lay on the northern edge of the bone field. The sand around them had been churned up by the impact. The first one was dead. A man. He'd fallen head first. Daniel checked his pulse, looked at his pupils. His neck was broken. Instant death. There was nothing he could do now. He moved on to the second one. A woman, about 30 years old, unconscious, but breathing. Her leg was twisted the wrong way. An open fracture of the tibia. Blood. A lot of blood. Daniel pulled off his shirt, teared it apart, applied a tourniquet above the knee, immobilized the leg with a piece of lying nearby. He worked quickly. His hands remembered. Not the hands of a medical professional, the hands of an anthropologist who had seen the consequences of exactly such fractures dozens of times. He knew what a properly reset leg looked like, and he knew what one that wasn't looked like. The third. A man. Young. About 25 years old. Alive. Conscious. He was lying on his back, whimpering quietly, both hands pressed against his chest. Ribs. At least 2 fractures. But his lungs were intact. His breathing was steady. He'll live. Fourth. A man. Heavy set. Military bearing. Broad shoulders. Calloused hands. He'd landed better than anyone else. He'd rolled with the impact. A soldier's instinct. He was on his knees. He stared at Daniel with wild eyes. He was saying something. Daniel didn't understand a word. The language was unfamiliar. Guttural. Lots of consonants. Daniel raised his hands. He showed his open palms. A universal gesture. I'm not an enemy. The soldier fell silent. Then he slowly began to speak again. In different words. Simpler. Even simpler. As if he were trying out different dialects. Daniel shook his head. Nothing. Zero. He didn't understand a single word of this world. A language. He needed a language. He turned toward the field of bones. 40,000 skeletons. Among them were surely teachers, scribes, translators. He approached the nearest row. He began to touch them. A warrior. A fisherman. A mason. A child. A weaver. He was searching, quickly, methodically, like in a database. On the 11th skeleton he found her. A woman, 52 years old. Long, slender fingers. Minimal physical wear and tear. Not a manual laborer. Mental labor. He placed his palms on her bones. The name came slowly, with difficulty, as if this woman had been reluctant to open up during her lifetime. Osena. She was a translator. She knew 4 dialects and the common trade language of Ira Kiora. Daniel named her. Osena. Translator. You knew words better than anyone around you. You died of a blood disease. You were 52. The bones glowed, dissolved. Knowledge washed over him like a warm wave. Not instant fluency, not like that. More as if he'd been studying the language for 2 years and suddenly everything fell into place. He understood. Not everything, but the basics, the structure, the roots of the words, the logic of the grammar. That would be enough. He turned to the soldier. The soldier was still on his knees. Watching as Daniel placed his hands on the skeleton, how the skeleton vanished. The soldier was pale. Daniel spoke, slowly, choosing his words carefully. I'm a friend. You're safe. Here. The soldier blinked. Then he exhaled so forcefully that he slumped down. He replied, his voice trembling. What kind of place is this? Daniel looked around. At the endless rows of bones, at the 2 wounded men, at the 1 dead man, at the 2 moons that had already appeared in the fading sky. He said, I don't know yet, but I'll figure it out. The soldier's name was Brom Hart, a former sergeant in the 4th Crown's garrison guard, exiled for disobeying an order. The order was to burn the village. Brom refused. He wasn't executed. Execution is quick and clean. He was banished here, to an island from which no one had ever returned. Daniel listened. He took it all in. He asked brief questions. His command of the language improved with every passing minute, like a forgotten skill coming back to him. The woman with the broken bone was named Dana, a former fabric merchant. She forged a receipt to save a debtor from debt slavery. She was caught, exiled. The young man with the broken ribs was named Pill, a former apothecary's apprentice. He sold medicine to the poor at a price below the guild's set rate. The guild considered this theft. He was exiled. The 4th. Dead. Brom said his name was Kot, an old man, 63 years old, a former librarian, exiled for possessing banned books. He didn't survive the fall. Daniel walked over to Kot's body. He closed his eyes. He said quietly, Kot, librarian, 63. You loved books. That's what killed you. Then he turned to Brom. He said, help me carry the wounded. I have a camp. There's water there. Brom nodded. He was big, strong. He lifted Dana into his arms like a child. Daniel supported Pyle. They walked across the field of bones. Brom was silent. He looked around. Daniel saw him turn pale. Brom was a soldier. He'd seen the dead. But not like this. Not fields of the dead. Not rows. Not thousands. They reached the camp. Daniel laid the wounded down, gave them water, a sip each, gathered more clams, cracked the shells with a stone, fed them. Dana came too. She saw the splint on his leg. She looked at Daniel. She asked quietly, Are you a healer? Daniel thought for a moment. He said, No, I read the dead. She didn't understand. He didn't bother to explain. Night fell. The second night for Daniel, the first for the others. Brom sat at the edge of the camp. He wasn't sleeping. He was hummed to himself. An old habit. Daniel sat beside him. He was looking at the horizon. A movement, far off. White silhouettes in the moonlight. Brom saw them too. He clenched his fists. He whispered, The undead. Daniel put his hand on Brom's shoulder. He said, They can't see us, as long as we don't touch them. Brom looked at him. How? Daniel shrugged. We don't have what they're looking for. We're empty. Brom was silent for a long time. Then he said, On the mainland, being empty is a death sentence. Daniel nodded. But here, it's the only thing that protects us. A week had passed. Daniel counted the days with notches on a stone. 7 notches. 7 days in the new world. Over the course of that week, he had read 83 skeletons. He had absorbed 4, Corin, Tarn, Osenna, and the 4th, an old shipwright named Hessa. He died at 60 after falling from the mast. He'd spent his whole life tying knots and mending rigging. Daniel inherited from him hands that could tie ropes with his eyes closed. Or rather, not the hands themselves. Muscle memory, an understanding of tension, a feel for the fibers. From seaweed and mollusk tendons, he braided 15 meters of coarse rope in 2 days. Brom watched in silence. Then he said, "You tie knots like an old sailor." Daniel replied, "I am an old sailor." A little. Brom didn't understand. But he was used to not understanding. Dana was recovering, slowly. The fracture was nasty. The bone had been sticking out on the first day. Daniel set it as best he could. He applied a splint made of reeds and broken ribs. He bound it with seaweed. It was a far cry from surgery, but the bone snapped back into place. Dana was a strong woman. She gritted her teeth. She didn't scream. She only howled quietly when she thought no one could hear her. Daniel heard her. Pill was breathing easier. His ribs were healing. He was young. His body was coping. By the 5th day, he was already walking. On the 6th, he helped gather shellfish. On the 7th, he approached Daniel and asked, "Can I write down the names too?"
I have good handwriting.
Daniel gave him a stone and a stub of seaweed charcoal. Pill began copying the names from the flat stone onto separate shards, 1 name per shard, in neat, small handwriting. Every evening, Brom patrolled the camp's perimeter. He drove 6 fin bone sticks into the sand, stretched Daniel's rope between them, and hung shells on the rope. If anyone passed by, the shells would ring out. A primitive alarm system. Daniel approved. He said, "Good." Brom nodded. He wasn't used to praise. Daniel worked every day, methodically. 4 hours in the morning, 4 in the evening, between the fields and the camp. He walked among the rows of skeletons. He touched them. He read. He took notes. He returned. He rarely absorbed them. Each absorption required precision, absolute precision. A mistake came at a high price. He remembered the rule. If he made a mistake in a name, or in the cause of death, or in something essential, the bone would poison him. He would feel the pain that the dead person had carried. Not a skill. Pain. He didn't learn this from instructions. There were no instructions. He learned it from the bones themselves, from the way they hummed when he approached carelessly, from the way they pushed his hand away when he was in a hurry. The bones would not tolerate lies. The bones wanted the truth, the whole truth, and only then would they reveal themselves. The evening of the 7th day. Daniel sat by a flat rock, updating his records. 83 names, 4 skills. Skills. Breath holding, water finding, language, knots. Not many, but every skill was genuine, tested by the life and death of a real person. Brom approached, sat down beside him, his face tense. He said quietly, "They're closer today." Daniel looked up. The undead, the horizon, white silhouettes. Yes, closer. Before, they used to pass by a kilometer away. Today, 500 meters. Brom said, "Yesterday I saw one stop. It was looking in our direction." Daniel nodded. "I saw it too," Brom said. "We need weapons." Daniel shook his head. "Weapons won't help against skeletons. There are too many of them." Brom clenched his jaw. He said, "Then what?" Daniel looked out at the field of bones. He said, "Names." Brom didn't answer. He didn't understand. Not yet, anyway. They came at night. Daniel woke up to the clanging of shells on a rope. He sat up. In the moonlight, he saw them. 200, maybe more. A wall of skeletons. They moved slowly, all in the same direction. Toward the camp. No, through the camp. A wave, like a tide. Brom jumped up. In his hands, a stick made from a fin, sharpened. His face was ashen. The saw trembled behind the rock. Dana lay there with her eyes open. She couldn't get up. Brom hissed, "What should we do?" Daniel stood up. His heart was pounding. The fear was immense, overwhelming. But his hands didn't tremble. He said to Brom, "Stay put. Don't move." Don't attack. They can't see us until we attack. Brom gripped the stick. Every muscle in his body wanted to fight. He was a soldier. Soldiers fight. But he looked at Daniel, at his calm face, at his empty hands, and didn't. Daniel left the camp. He walked toward the wave, barefoot, unarmed. He stopped 20 paces from the first row of skeletons. They were coming. Empty eye sockets, clicking jaws, bones grinding against one another. 200 dead, and one living man. Daniel dropped to his knees. He placed his palms on the sand. He closed his eyes, and he began to listen. The field. It was humming. Every skeleton in the wave had its own frequency, its own story, its own pain. It pressed against his temples, against the back of his head. Too much data. He sifted through it, filtered it, like in a lab. When you have 100 samples in front of you and need to find the 7 that relate to a single event, he looked for the ones closest to him, the ones leading the way. 7. The front row. 40 minutes. He'd been kneeling for 40 minutes. The wave was approaching. 10 meters. 5. 3. Brom, behind him, prayed silently. Daniel opened his eyes. He stood up. He walked toward it and began to speak. Loudly, calmly. Haldi, gunsmith, left-handed, died of a fever. The first skeleton in the row stopped, froze, as if someone had pressed pause. Mira, midwife, 12 other people's children, had none of her own. The second one stopped. Toba, fisherman, 22 years old, drowned in a storm. The third, Vilda, blacksmith's wife, died in childbirth. The fourth, Anish, weaver, 60 years old, exhaustion. The fifth, Orin, hunter, 35, fell from a cliff. The sixth, Hess, shipwright, 60, fell from the mast. Seventh, 7 names. 7 skeletons froze, and then they turned. Slowly, with a wooden creak. They turned their backs on Daniel, facing the rest of the wave, and stood. A wall. The wave stood. 200 skeletons behind the line of 7. Frozen, swaying, clicking, but not moving forward. A minute passed. 5. 10. The wave began to recede, slowly, like a real tide, ebbing back into the darkness. The 7 skeletons stood their ground, with their backs to the camp, facing the field, on guard. Daniel stood. His legs were giving out. The adrenaline was wearing off. His hands began to shake, but he stood. Behind him, Brom lowered his staff. Pill stopped trembling. Dana lay on her back, staring at the sky. She was silent. Brom approached, quietly, as if approaching something fragile. He said, "What's going on? You defeated them with politeness." Daniel didn't turn around. His voice was hoarse from tension. He replied, "I introduced them. It's just been a very long time since anyone said hello to them." Brom was silent for a long time. Then he said, "I've seen many officers, good and bad, strong and weak, but I've never seen anyone stop an army with just names." Daniel sat down on the sand. His legs had finally given out. He looked at the 7 skeletons standing between the camp and the darkness. He said quietly, "They're not an army. They're people. They used to be people. They'd just forgotten." In the morning, the 7 skeletons were still standing. They didn't move. They didn't leave. A wall of 7 dead men. A guard. A voluntary one. Daniel approached each one. He placed his hand on their shoulder blade. He quietly said each one's name, like "Good morning." Haldi, Mira, Toba, Vilda, Anish, Orin, Hessa. 7 dead sentinels, the first inhabitants of the future city. After the night of the 7 names, everything changed. Brom stopped asking why Daniel spent hours poring over the bones. Pill doubled the pace at which he inscribed the names on the stone shards. Dana, from her reclining position, began sorting the stones by size. Everyone did what they could. The camp, once a makeshift stopover, was turning into something meaningful. On the 9th day, Daniel found the first confirmation of his theory. He was working in the northern section of the field. The skeletons there were larger. Men. Tall, broad, powerful bones, thick brow ridges, calloused phalanges. Warriors. Every single one of them. He touched them one by one. Soldiers, a swordsman, a spearman, a shield bearer, an archer, all had died in battle. All bore battle wounds, gashes on their ribs, healed fractures of the forearms, crushed temples. The northern field was a field of warriors. He returned to the western section where he had started. Women, old people, children, artisans, fishermen, weavers, midwives. The western field was a field of ordinary people. He headed east, toward the dark hollows he had seen on the first day. He didn't make it. Halfway there, he came across a different kind of skeleton. Small, slender, with distinctive hands, long fingers, minimal physical wear and tear. Scholars, scribes, translators, architects. The eastern field was the field of minds. Someone had sorted the dead, like books in a library, by category. Warriors in the north, common folk in the west, the intelligent in the east. Daniel stood at the border between the eastern and northern sectors. The wind ruffled his hair. He thought, this isn't a random dumping ground, it's a catalog. Someone had been gathering people here for centuries, bringing them, waiting for them to die, arranging them. Why? Why would anyone need a warehouse full of sorted corpses? There was no answer yet, but the question wouldn't let him go. He returned to camp around noon. Brahm met him at the entrance. His face looked different, tense, but not frightened. More like agitated. He said, "They're moving." Daniel asked, "Who?" Brahm nodded toward the 7 skeletal sentries. They were standing there, as usual, with their backs to the camp, but not in the same spot. Overnight, they had moved 3 meters south, all 7 of them, at the same time, as if they'd shifted the perimeter. Daniel walked over to them. He looked. Footprints in the sand. Yes, they'd shifted, expanded the zone. He placed his hand on Haldy's shoulder, the first of the 7, and sensed it. Not hostility, not a command, an intention. Dim, warm, like the muttering of a sleeper. They were guarding, not because he'd ordered them to, because he had called them by name. And now they knew there was someone watching over them, someone who remembers. Daniel withdrew his hand. He said quietly, "Thank you, Haldy. Good work." The armorer's skull twitched slightly, barely noticeable, like a nod. On the 10th day, Daniel decided to take a risk. He needed a construction skill. The camp was just rocks and seaweed. That wasn't enough. He needed walls, a roof, supports. He needed someone who knew how to build. He set out for the western field. He searched for 3 hours. He touched the skeletons. He filtered through them. He weeded them out. And he found one. A large male skeleton, broad arms, huge palms, fingers flattened from constant work with a hammer. The left knee was worn down. A man who had spent a lot of time on his knees, in front of something low, in front of a boat, or in front of a foundation. Daniel placed both hands on the ribcage. He closed his eyes. Jonas. The name came to him heavily, thick, like resin. Jonas was a shipwright, 57 years old. For 30 of those years, he built ships. Not big ones, fishing boats, docks, sheds on the shore. He knew wood. He knew how it dried, bent, and cracked. He knew how to set up a support so it could hold 10 times its own weight. He knew how to build a roof from scratch that wouldn't leak at the first rain. He died of old age. Quietly, in his workshop, next to an unfinished boat. Daniel opened his eyes. He said aloud, "Jonas, shipwright, 57 years old. You built boats for 30 years. You died where you lived, surrounded by wood and resin. Your hands knew every knot in every plank. The bones glowed, brighter than the previous ones. Jonas was a master. His skill ran deep. 30 years of the same work, day in and day out. The bones dissolved. They were absorbed, and Daniel staggered. The world shook. His head spun. He fell to one knee. Nausea, heat. His hands were burning. His fingers were throbbing. Too much, too fast. Jonas's skill was immense. Not just one trick, not just one ability, an entire profession. 30 years of experience were absorbed in a single second. His brain couldn't keep up. Daniel knelt there. He waited. He waited for it to pass. It passed after 10 minutes. The nausea subsided. The fever broke. But his hands had changed. He looked at the stone nearby, and he didn't see a stone in it. He saw a support, a beam, a masonry block. He looked at the long femur 2 steps away, and saw a rafter. He looked at the ribs laid out in rows, and saw roof tiles. The entire island was no longer a field of bones. It had become a warehouse of building materials. Jonas looked at the world as a builder, and now Daniel did too. He returned to camp. He sat down. He picked up a flat stone and a piece of charcoal. He began to sketch. A plan, A foundation of large stones, walls of ribs woven into a framework of fin bones and long femurs, a roof of shoulder blades and pelvic bones covered with seaweed and clay. Brom approached. He looked at the sketch. He said, "This is a house." Daniel replied, "This is a room. A warm room." Brom looked at him, then at the blueprint, then back at him. He said, "Made of bones." Daniel nodded. "From the bones of the people lying here. Every rib in the wall will be labeled. Every bone will bear the name of the person it belonged to. These aren't building materials, these are people, and they'll be part of the house." Brom was silent for a long time. Then he said, "On the mainland, only necromancers build with bones, and monsters." Daniel looked him in the eye. He replied, "But here, an anthropologist is building with bones, and he apologizes to every rib he takes." Brom didn't smile, but something in his expression softened. He said, "Show me what to do." They built for 3 days. Brom hauled stones. Pill brought bundles of ribs. Dana, lying on her back, wove fastening ropes from seaweed. Daniel directed the work. His hands knew what to do, Jonas's hands. He set the stones in place and checked the level by eye. And his eye was never wrong. A foundation of flat stones. 4 supports made of large thigh bones. Between them, a frame made of a fin. Walls of ribs, tightly laid, bound together, coated with a mixture of clay and ash. A roof of pelvic bones, covered with a layer of seaweed, pressed down by stones. A doorway facing south, toward the sea, so the wind could ventilate it. No windows. Not yet. By that day, by evening, the warm room stood. Small, 3 by 4 meters. The ceiling was low. Brom's head brushed against it. But inside it was dry. And when the first rain fell that night, short, fierce, and wind-driven, not a single drop fell inside. 4 people sat in the room made of bones and listened as the rain pounding on the roof made of the pelvic bones of dead fishermen and weavers. Daniel sat by the wall. He ran his finger along a rib protruding from the masonry. He said quietly, "That's Vilda's rib, the blacksmith's wife. She died in childbirth. She was 30.
Now she's holding up our wall."
Pill looked up. He asked, "You remember them all?" Daniel nodded. "All 83. Pill said quietly, "Then we don't live in a house of bones. We live in a house of names." Daniel looked at him. The pencil stub froze in his fingers for a second. Then he said, "Yes, that's exactly right." That night he wrote on the stone above the entrance, "The Warm Room, the first house of Cordrain." Brom had told him that name. Cordrain, the Bone Jaw. That's what they call this island on the mainland. A place from which no one returns. Daniel thought about that. Then he added beneath the name, "We're here." Brom looked at the inscription. He nodded. Dana fell asleep for the first time in a week without a moan. Pill curled up in the corner on a bed of dried seaweed. Daniel sat by the entrance looking outside. 7 skeletons stood in the darkness keeping watch. Rain ran down their bones. Daniel quietly spoke the 7 names, like a lullaby. Haldi, Mira, Toba, Vilda, Anish, Oren, Hess. Good night. Somewhere far beneath the island's central mound, something stirred. Warm, ancient, patient, having waited 300 years. And it smiled.
Toward the end of the 3rd week,
A second ship fell from the sky. Or rather, it didn't fall. It hovered. It jettisoned its cargo. It was gone. Daniel already knew the procedure. The hum of the air, copper plating against the backdrop of the bone-white moon. An open side, bodies falling downward. This time there were 6 of them. Brom ran first. Daniel followed him. Pill stayed with Dana. Her leg was healing, slowly, but she could already sit and work with her hands. 5 of the 6 survived. 1 had crashed. A woman in her 40s. She'd fallen onto the rocks. Daniel approached her. He closed her eyes. He placed his palm on her forehead. It was still warm. She'd died a minute ago. Her name came to him immediately. Telma, a seamstress, exiled for debts. He whispered her name, jotted it down in his notebook, the 84th name. The other 5 were alive. Bruises, dislocations, 1 broken finger. They were lucky. Among them was a girl, about 12 years old, thin, huge eyes. She wasn't crying. She wasn't screaming. She was sitting on the sand, staring straight ahead. Daniel walked over to her, sat down next to her, not too close. He said,
My name is Daniel. And you?
She was silent for a long time. Then she said one word. Nira. Daniel nodded. He said, Nira. I'll write that down. He took out a stone. He wrote it down, not on the list of the dead, but on a separate stone, the stone of the living. Nira looked at it. She blinked for the first time. She asked, Why? Daniel said, So you won't be forgotten. She turned away, but her fingers on her knees relaxed. Among the five was a man who introduced himself as Horn, a former miner. His hands were as thick as logs. His face was scarred by coal dust. He'd been exiled for participating in a riot. The riot had been because the miners had stopped being paid. Horn didn't riot. Horn just stood nearby. That was enough. There was a woman named Selva, about 35 years old, a former cook at the court of the Sixth Crown, exiled for eavesdropping on a conversation she wasn't supposed to hear. Daniel didn't ask what the conversation was about. It didn't matter. There was an old man, 70 years old. He called himself Kroon, a former gardener. He didn't say why he'd been exiled. He remained silent. He stared at the dice. His hands were shaking.
There was a young man,
20 years old. His name was Tane, a former student. He wrote poetry. One of his poems turned out to be objectionable. He was exiled. Daniel led everyone into the warm room. 9 people in a 3x4 room. Crowded. Very crowded. Brahm looked at Daniel. He said one word, an addition. Daniel nodded. The next morning they began building. A second room, then a third. Jonas, inside Daniel's head, designed non-stop. Every stone, every support, every rib in the wall. Horn proved indispensable. His miner's hands moved stones that even Brahm couldn't lift. Selva took charge of the kitchen. It was hard to call it a kitchen. A fire made from a fin, shells instead of pots, mollusks, seaweed, rainwater. But Selva was a cook, a real one. She saw these ingredients as a challenge. On the third day, she cooked something that vaguely resembled soup, salty, murky, with a hint of seaweed and shellfish. Daniel tasted it. He closed his eyes. He said, "This is the first soup on core drain in 500 years." Selva snorted. She replied, "This is the worst soup of my career." Daniel said, "Then it can only get better from here." Selva looked at him. She didn't smile, but she stopped frowning. By the end of the 4th week, the camp had 3 rooms, the warm room, the second room, and the kitchen, all made of bones, all labeled. Above the entrance to each one hung a stone bearing the names of those whose bones held up the walls. Pill carved the names neatly, in fine detail, beautifully. The former apothecary's apprentice turned out to be Cordrain's best calligrapher. Daniel worked non-stop. In the morning, he read the bones. In the afternoon, he built. In the evening, he wrote down the names. At night, he patrolled the perimeter and talked with the 7 guards. He had lost weight. His cheekbones were sharp. Dark circles lay under his eyes. Brahm once caught him by the arm. "You're not sleeping," Brahm said. "I am," Daniel replied. 3 hours a night isn't sleep," Brahm said. "It's torture. You'll break." Daniel looked at him. He wanted to argue. He didn't. Brahm was right. That night he lay down and slept for 8 hours. For the first time in 3 weeks. In the morning he felt like a different person. By the 5th week, Daniel began exploring the eastern passages. Entrances to the catacombs, caves, darkness. Inside it was dry and cool. The walls were made of stone. Smooth. Not natural. Someone had carved out these passages long ago. A very long time ago. There were markings on the walls. Symbols. Daniel couldn't read them. The Osena language didn't cover these ancient texts. But he could read the bones lying inside. There were skeletons in the catacombs. Others. Older than the ones in the field. Much older. The bones had darkened with age. The mineralization was deep. These remains weren't decades old. Centuries. Maybe more. He touched the first one. And he pulled his hand away. Too much. Too loud. This dead man was no ordinary person. The resonance was deafening. as if the bone were screaming. Daniel stepped back. He sat down against the wall. He waited for his heart to calm down. He tried again, more carefully, with his fingertips. A man, age indeterminate, bones of incredible density. In life he had drawn from the canvas, strongly, deeply. A mage, a true mage, or whatever they were called here. A resonator. The name wouldn't come to him. Too deep, too far away. Daniel didn't push it. He didn't rush. He jotted down the coordinates in his notebook. He marked it. Object K1. Catacombs. Further analysis required. He moved on. There were 11 more skeletons in the catacombs. All the same. Old, powerful, solid. All of them emitted a resonance that made his teeth chatter. And all were laid out in the same way. On their backs. Arms across their chests. Heads facing west. Feet facing east. A ritual pose. Daniel recognized this pose. He'd seen it in Cambodia, in the ancient royal tombs. That's how those who were revered were buried. Not slaves, not followers, guardians. He emerged from the catacombs at sunset. He sat down on a rock by the entrance. He gazed at the island for a long time, at the fields of bones, at the 3 small huts, at the smoke rising from Selva's campfire, at Pila, who was carving names by the light of the setting sun. The island was multi-layered. On top, a dump, a prison, a place of death. Beneath the surface, a catalog, a library of the dead. And even deeper, in the catacombs, there is something else, something old, powerful, and incomprehensible. Daniel returned to camp. Brahm was waiting at the entrance, his face serious. He said, "Old man Kroon wants to leave." Daniel stopped. "Leave for where?" Brahm shrugged. "He says there are other camps on the island. He says he knows the way." Daniel went into the warm room. Kroon was sitting against the wall. He had no belongings. No one on Cordrain had any belongings. Daniel sat down across from him. He asked, "You want to leave?" Kroon nodded without looking up. Daniel asked, "Why?" Kroon was silent for a long time. Then he said, "I don't deserve to be here, within these walls, among these names." Daniel waited. Kroon continued, "I'm a gardener, that's true. But I wasn't exiled because of the garden. I was exiled because I informed on a man. He was my neighbor, a good man. I informed on him because I was paid. They took him away. They took his family away. Then they took me away, because I became a witness. Nobody needs a living witness." Silence. The saw stopped cutting. Brahm stood at the entrance. He didn't move. Nira sat in the corner. She listened. Daniel was silent for a long time. Then he spoke. "What was his name?" Kroon looked up. His eyes were filled with horror. He whispered, "Dolly. His name was Dolly. He was a carpenter. He had 2 children." Daniel took out a stone. He wrote it down. Dolly, carpenter, 2 children. A denunciation. Kroon. He looked at Kroon. He said, "You did a terrible thing." Kroon shuddered. Daniel continued, "But you named him. You remember him. You remember his children. You carry him inside you every day. This isn't atonement. There is no atonement. But it's honesty. And honesty is the only currency here." Kroon looked at him. Tears streamed down his wrinkled face. Daniel said, "You can leave. I'm not stopping you. But if you stay, you'll remember Dolly. Every day. Out loud. That's your job." Kroon stayed. Every morning he would step out of the warm room. He would face east. And he would say, "Dolly, carpenter, 2 children. I remember." No one commented. No one judged. On Cordrain, everyone had their own dead. In the 2nd month, Hana Shin arrived. Not by airship, by boat. Or rather, by the wreckage of a boat. Brahm was the first to see her. In the morning, at dawn. A dark spot on the water by the southern cliffs. He ran to Daniel, told him, something in the water. Daniel went down to the shore. Tarn's experience told him, "The current is gentle today. High tide in 2 hours. The wreckage will be washed up on the rocks." They waited. The debris turned out to be a piece of the ship's side, a long plank with copper plating. A woman was lying on the plank, face down. One arm dangled into the water. The other was clinging to a crack in the wood. Brom waded into the water and pulled her out. She was alive, barely. Her breathing was shallow. Her pulse was faint. Her skin was cold. How long had she been in the sea? A day? 2? On her left shoulder was a wound, deep, ragged, inflamed. The edges were green. An infection, pus. Daniel examined the wound. Bad, very bad. Without antibiotics, she'll die in 2 days, maybe 3. On her back, between her shoulder blades, was a brand, burned into her skin. A symbol Daniel had already seen on the copper plaques in the catacombs, the mark of the second crown. And next to it, 2 words in the trade language, false witness. They carried her into the warm room. They laid her on a bed of seaweed. Daniel sat down beside her. He thought. He had no medicine, no instruments, no medical knowledge. He was an anthropologist. He read the dead. He didn't treat the living, but he could find someone who could. He went out. He walked to the eastern field. He searched for 2 hours. He found the skeleton of a woman with distinctive hands, slender fingers, very slender, but strong. Her fine motor skills were incredibly developed. A surgeon, or someone close to one. He touched them. He read them for a long time, carefully. Ennis, not a surgeon, a herbalist. She knew plants. She knew how to clean a wound, how to make a compress from sea moss, how to use the ash of certain algae as an antiseptic. Daniel named her. Ennis, a herbalist, 43 years old. You treated fishermen after storms. You knew every herb on the coast. The bones dissolved. The knowledge sank in. Not surgery, but enough. He returned to camp, gathered brown seaweed from the rocks, dried a handful on a rock by the fire, ground it into a powder, mixed it with the ashes from a fin, rinsed the wound with seawater. She cried out. She didn't wake up, but she cried out. He applied a compress, secured it with strips of seaweed, sat down beside her, waited. Selva brought water, warm, with a drop of shellfish broth. They poured it into her mouth, drop by drop. Pill held her head. Nira sat in the corner and watched intently. Night. Fever. The woman tossed and turned. She muttered. In the language of the eastern provinces, Daniel could make out the words every other time. She kept repeating the same thing. The dosage was correct. The dosage was correct. I wasn't wrong. Daniel didn't know what she was talking about, but he wrote it down, in his notebook. Exactly. In the morning, the fever hadn't subsided. A second compress. A third. Daniel changed the bandages every 4 hours. He slept in fits and starts. Selva was making broth. Brom was guarding the entrance. Everyone else was tiptoeing around. On the second day, Daniel started reading to her. Not from a book. There weren't any. He was reading from the notebook. A list of names. Monotonously, quietly, like a lecture. Haldi, the armorer. Left-handed. Fever. Mira, midwife. 12 births. Corin, 8 years old. Crab. He didn't know if it would help, didn't know why he was doing it. He just knew that a living person's voice is an anchor, that people in a delirium don't hear words but tone, and that the tone of reciting names is the tone of presence. I'm here. I remember. You're not alone. By evening on the 3rd day, the fever had subsided. She opened her eyes. Gray, large, clear. She looked at Daniel. He was sitting next to her, with a notebook. On the 143rd name, she asked in a hoarse voice. What are you reading? Daniel said, names. People who were here before you. She paused. Then she said, where am I? Daniel said, Core Drain, an island. You're safe. She closed her eyes, opened them, said, my name is Hannah Shin. I'm a military medic. I used to be. Daniel wrote it down right in front of her, on a rock. Hannah Shin, military medic, arrived on a boat wreck, alive. She watched him write. Then she said quietly, why are you doing this? Daniel answered without looking up. So you don't disappear. Hannah was recovering slowly. Her shoulder was healing. The infection was receding. The compresses were working. Ennis knew her stuff. In a week, Hannah could sit up. In 2, she could walk. She was silent a lot. She watched. She studied the camp, the people, the walls of bones, the inscriptions on the stones. The 7 skeletal sentries along the perimeter. She didn't comment on anything. In the 3rd week, she approached Daniel. He was sitting in the eastern field, reading another skeleton. She sat down next to him. She was silent for 10 minutes. Then she said, "I'm a medic. I can help."
But I need tools.
Daniel looked at her. "What kind?" "Needles. Thin ones, strong ones, thread, something for ligation, something for disinfection that's more reliable than seaweed ash." Daniel nodded. "Needles, thin ones, strong ones." He looked at his hands. Bone engineering. He hadn't tried it for... Absorbed bones provided skills, but they also provided material. He could feel it inside him, a reserve, like a second skeleton beneath his skin. Structures could be drawn outward from this material. Temporary, but sturdy. He concentrated. He sensed the material. Corin, Tarn, Osenna, Hess, Jonas, Ennis. 6 absorbed, 6 sources of bone mass. He focused on the tip of his right index finger. He imagined a needle. Thin, long, strong, like a surgical needle. Pain, brief, sharp. A needle emerged from beneath his fingernail. White, bone, 2 centimeters long, perfectly smooth, sharp as a razor. Daniel pulled it out, examined it, ran it along his finger. A drop of blood, sharp. He held it out to Hannah. She took it, turned it over in her hand, held it up to the light, looked up at Daniel. There was something new in her eyes. Not fear, not surprise. Professional interest. She said,
3 more. And thinner.
Daniel made 3 more, each thinner than the last. The 4th was as thin as a hair. Hannah laid them out on the rock. She looked at them. She said, "These are the best needles I've ever held." Daniel thought for a moment. Then he said, "They're made from a boy who used to dive for crabs, from an old man who searched for water, from a translator who knew 4 languages, from a sailor, from a carpenter, from a herbalist." Hannah was silent for a long time. Then she said, "Then I'll sew carefully with them." And so their work began. Hannah treated the patients. Daniel provided the tools. She asked, he made them. A clamp, a splint, a fixation plate, a drainage tube. Every tool made of bone, every one precise, every one tailored to her hand, to her grip, to the angle she was used to working at. Hannah noticed this on the 2nd day. She paused. She looked at the bone clamp. She turned it over in her hand. It fit her palm like a glove. She asked, "Are you making these for me?" Daniel didn't look up from the skeleton he was studying. He replied, "Of course. You're left-handed. Your grip angle is 23 degrees.
The pressure on your distal phalanges is above average. Standard tools don't work for you."
Hannah stood there. She was silent. Then she said quietly, "How do you know my grip angle?" Daniel finally looked up. He looked at her. He shrugged. He said, "I'm an anthropologist. I read people by their bones, the living too." In the 4th month, Daniel found proof. He was working in the eastern field. A deep layer. Skeletons beneath skeletons. He'd excavated the top layer a week ago. Beneath it was a 2nd layer. Beneath the 2nd, a 3rd. 3 layers of the dead. 3 eras. The bottom layer was the oldest. The bones were almost stony from mineralization. They were at least 300 years old. The middle layer, about 150 years old. The top layer, the last few decades. 3 generations of exiles, laid one on top of the other, neatly, all facing the same direction. Someone had come here once a generation to add a new layer. At the junction of the 2nd and 3rd layers, Daniel found it. A copper plate, the size of a palm, thin, tarnished, with engraved symbols, numbers, letters, codes. He couldn't read it all. Osenna's language didn't cover this dialect.
But he recognized the format.
An inventory card. Number, category, date, quantity of units. Units, not people. Storage units. Daniel sat on the sand. He held the copper plate. His hands didn't tremble. He had seen mass graves. Cambodia, Bosnia. He'd seen what people do to other people. But there, it was rage, hatred, madness. Here it was different. Here it was bookkeeping, neat, methodical. Someone's hand had written down the numbers, counted the bones, marked the categories, like merchandise in a warehouse. He brought the plate back to camp. He placed it on the table in the kitchen. Everyone gathered around. Daniel said, "Cordrain isn't a prison. It's a warehouse." Brom frowned. "What do you mean?" Daniel pointed to the plate. An inventory card, lot number, delivery date, product category. Someone's keeping track. Someone's counting the dead, not for remembrance, for use. Silence. Selva said quietly, "What kind of use?" Daniel shook his head. "I don't know yet. But the bones aren't just lying here. They're sorted. Warriors separately, artisans separately, scholars separately, mages in the catacombs. This isn't a cemetery. It's a library. And someone is reading it."
Horn slammed his fist on the table. The stone cracked. He said through clenched teeth,
"They're dumping us in here like firewood in a woodpile." Daniel nodded. "Exactly." He turned to Nira. The girl was sitting by the wall, listening, her eyes wide. Daniel said gently, "Nira, go to Selva. Help with dinner." Nira left. Daniel continued, "Quiet. We need to know more. We need to decipher these markings. We need to understand the system. But for that, I need someone who knows the languages of the Corones, the old crests." "Trade codes," Brom said. "An aristocrat." Daniel nodded. "An aristocrat." In her 5th month, Everly Kane fell from the sky. Literally. The third group of exiles. 8 people. Everly was among them. She stood out from the rest like a gold coin in a pile of copper coins. Blonde hair, straight back, clear speech. A dress made of fabric Daniel had never seen on the island before. She stood on a field of bones. Barefoot. Her dress torn from the fall. Her knee was broken, but her back was straight, and her chin was held high. Everyone else was sitting or lying down. She was standing. Daniel approached her. He said, "My name is Daniel. I'm the oldest here. Let's go. It's safe here." She looked at him, from head to toe, even though she was half a head shorter than him. She said, "I'm Everly Kane, daughter of Count Kane, 3rd Crown." Brom, standing behind Daniel, let out a barely audible whistle. Daniel nodded. He took note. He held out his hand. She looked at his hand, at the calluses, at the dirty nails, at the bone dust on his fingers. She didn't take it. She went on her own. Everly's first week at the camp was tough, for everyone. She refused to eat from the communal pot. She refused to sleep on the seaweed mattress. She refused to carry out the waste bins. Selva sang quietly. Horn made no secret of his irritation. Brom remained silent. Daniel watched. He could see that Everly wasn't being capricious. She was defending herself, the only way she knew how, through status. Because when everything has been taken from you, status is the last thing that remains. The illusion of a wall between you and the abyss. On the 5th day, Daniel sat down next to her on a rock by the shore. He was silent. She was silent too, for about 10 minutes. Then he took out a copper plate. He placed it in front of her. He said, "You can read the old trade languages." She looked at the plate. She picked it up. Her fingers traced the symbols. Her eyes changed. They were the eyes of someone who recognizes something familiar. She said, "This is Styrish, the old trade cipher of the 3rd Crown." Daniel said, "You can read it." She was already reading it. Her fingers moved over the symbols. Her lips moved. A minute later, she said, "Batch number 341. Category, skilled craftsman. Quantity, 92 units. Date, the 14th year of Ultan II's reign." That was about 130 years ago. Daniel looked at her. She looked up. Then was something sharp, something evil. She said, "My family traded in people." Daniel shook his head. "No, your family traded in the dead. That's worse." Everly was silent for a long time. Then she said, "You have more plates like this." Daniel nodded. 14. I found them over the last month." Everly stood up. She brushed off her skirt, a habit from another life. She said, "Show me everything." From that day on, Everly worked, for real, from morning till night. She sat in a secluded corner of the second room. Copper plates lay on a stone slab in front of her. Next to them were shards with Daniel's notes. She deciphered them. She translated them. She organized them. Her brain was built for this. 6 languages, a diplomatic education, knowledge of the coats of arms of all 7 crowns, knowledge of trade codes and ciphers. She read the copper plates the way an accountant reads invoices, with cold precision and with growing horror. By the 3rd week, she approached Daniel. Her face was pale. Her hands were clenched into fists. She said, "I recognize the handwriting, on plate number 7. Daniel waited. Everly said, "It's my father's handwriting." Silence. Daniel said, "Are you sure?" She nodded. "He wrote me letters every week while I was at the academy. I recognize his slant, the way he puts a dot over the ket symbol. It's his handwriting. My father signed the catalog cards of dead people." Tears streamed down her face. Not from grief, from rage. She cried like someone who had finally seen the knife in their back and recognized whose hand was holding it. Daniel didn't try to comfort her, didn't try to hug her. He took out a stone. He made a note. Plate number 7. Count Kane's handwriting. The 3rd crown. Confirmed by Everly Kane. She looked at the note, wiped her tears with the back of her hand. She said, "You're writing everything down." Daniel replied, "Everything. Every name, every fact, every piece of evidence." She asked, "Why?" Daniel looked at her. He said, "Because one day someone will ask what happened here, and I want the answer to be accurate." The 6th month, Oion. Daniel gave the city its name at the end of the 5th month, from the Greek word meaning a structural unit of bone. He explained this to Brom. Brom didn't understand a thing, but he remembered the name. Oion. It sounded solid. Now there were 23 people in the town. 6 buildings. The warm room, the second room, the kitchen, the infirmary, the workshop, the school. Calling it a school was a bit of a stretch. A shelter made of ribs and reeds. Beneath it, a stone instead of a blackboard. Charcoal stubs instead of chalk. Daniel taught the children. There were 4 of them, Nira, and 3 from the latest group of exiles. He taught them to read, in the trade language, using the only texts they had on hand, using the inscribed skulls. Every morning the children sat in a circle. In front of each one lay a stone with a name on it. Daniel would say, "Read." Nira ran her finger along the stone. She pronounced, "Haldi, armorer." A boy named Dovar, 7 years old, pronounced it syllable by syllable. Meira, po vi tu ha. A girl named Tili, 9 years old. She read quickly, but quietly, almost in a whisper, as if she were afraid to disturb the dead. A boy named Ren, 10. He didn't know how to read. Daniel taught him from scratch, letter by letter. Ren got angry. He cried. He threw stones. Daniel picked the stones, put them back, said, "Let's try again." Ren screamed that he couldn't. Daniel said, "You can." Ren screamed that he was useless, that was why he'd been cast out. Daniel sat down next to him, spoke softly. "You weren't cast out because you're useless. You were kicked out because the ones who kicked you out are useless." Ren fell silent. Then he picked up a stone again. By the 3rd week, Ren had read the first name in its entirety. Koren, 8 years old. He looked at Daniel. He asked, "He was the same age as me." Daniel nodded. Almost. Ren was silent for a long time. Then he said, "I'll remember him." Daniel put his hand on Ren's shoulder. He said, "He'll be glad." Hana worked in the infirmary. Every day. No days off. The exiles arrived with injuries, with illnesses, with exhaustion. She treated them all. With Daniel's bone needles. With seaweed compresses based on Ennis's recipe. With reed splints. She was a brilliant healer, precise, quick, calm. But Daniel saw it. At night, when she thought no one was watching, Hana would sit by the infirmary wall. She'd look at her hands, and her hands would tremble. She didn't trust them, even now. Ever since that day when a child died in her arms from a switched medication, she'd done everything right, but the child died, and Hana stopped believing that doing the right thing mattered. Daniel knew. He could read the living just as well as the dead, by their bones, their posture, the way a person held a tool. Hana held the needle like a bomb, too cautiously, too tensely. Every stitch was flawless, but each one cost her 10 seconds of doubt. In his 6th month, Daniel was working in the eastern field. A deep layer, ancient bones. And he found what he was looking for. A small skeleton. A child. 5 years old. A boy. The bones were thin, fragile. Daniel touched them, and it pierced him. Poison. This child had died of poison, a specific alkaloid, of plant origin. He could feel the poison eating away at the child's insides, how the little child's heart first raced, then slowed, then stopped. Daniel didn't absorb it all. He just read, for a long time, all night. He pieced together the picture from the bones, from micro traces in the tooth enamel, from changes in the bone tissue of the ribs, from the nature of the mineralization. The report took 3 pages of fine handwriting. The exact dosage of the poison, the method of administration, the speed of action, and most importantly, the antidote that could have saved the child. The correct antidote, the very one that Hana had administered to that child on the mainland. He couldn't know that for sure. He didn't know the details of Hana's story, but he knew the poison, this method, this dosage, and he knew that the correct treatment was exactly what any competent doctor would have done. In the morning, he came to the infirmary. Hana was bandaging Gorn's arm. The miner had cut himself on a rock. Daniel waited. When she finished, he placed 3 stones in front of her. He said, "Read this." Hana read. Slowly. Her face changed. It paled. It hardened. She was realizing. Daniel saw the realization wash over her in waves. The type of poison. Match. The dosage. Match. The clinical picture. Match. She finished reading. She looked on her eyes. They were brimming with tears. Daniel said, "The dosage you administered to that child, it was correct. This poison kills in 40 minutes. The antidote takes effect in 20. You administered it in time. But the medicine had been tampered with. The substance in the ampule was inert. A placebo. You were deceived. You didn't make a mistake, Hana. Here's the proof." She sat motionless for 10 minutes. Daniel didn't move. He didn't speak. He was just there. Then she asked, "Where was that child from?" Daniel said, "The eastern field, the deep layer." He was 5. The same poison, the same method. This isn't a coincidence, Hana. It's a pattern. Someone has been using this poison systematically. She remained silent for another 5 minutes. Then she stood up. She walked over to the table. She picked up a needle, a bone one. That first one, the thinnest one. She twirled it between her fingers. Her hands didn't tremble. For the first time ever. She said quietly, "Can I work with you?" "Not in the infirmary. With you. There. In the field." Daniel nodded. From that day on, they worked together. Daniel read the bones. Hana compiled medical reports. Causes of death, nature of the injuries, signs of poisoning, traces of violence. 2 specialists, an anthropologist and a medical professional, working on the largest mass grave in world history. They worked in silence. For hours. Side by side, shoulder to shoulder. Sometimes Daniel would speak. "A woman, 40, a healed fracture of the radius." Hana would reply. The nature of the union indicates repeated trauma, domestic violence. They understood each other without saying a word. 2 professionals, 2 languages, 1 job. Daniel didn't say a word more than necessary. Hana didn't say a word more than necessary. They became 2 hands working as one long before either of them said a single word out loud. The 7th month. They came from the sea. 20 people. A long galley flying a black flag. Brahm saw it at dawn. He ran to Daniel. His face was ashen. He said one word. Mercenaries. Oion froze. 23 people. 4 of them were children. 3 were wounded. 5 were women. There were at most 7 fighters. Brahm, Horn, Tain, who in half a year had gone from a student to a wiry young man. 4 more men from the latest groups. 7 against 20. Brahm began to prepare. He positioned his men. He handed out sticks, sharp shards of bone, a makeshift weapon. His face was stony. He was a sergeant again. Daniel stood to the side, thinking. The mercenaries had landed on the southern cliffs. Daniel watched from a distance. Heavy gear, swords, shields, crossbows. 2 men were dragging something wrapped in cloth. Long, heavy. Daniel didn't know what it was, but Brahm knew. He said quietly, "A ballista, a siege weapon. It can pierce a wall from 200 paces." Daniel asked, "They've come to kill us." Brahm nodded. You, everyone really, but you first and foremost. Light, Daniel remembered. The bonfires of the Selva, the lamps made from mollusk fat that they'd been crafting for the past month, the light of Oion, visible from the sea. The fishermen had said so. Someone on the mainland had heard about it. Someone had decided that the light on Cordrain was a problem.
20 mercenaries is the answer, Brom said.
We have 3 hours before they get here from the cliffs. Maybe 4. The trail is rough, Daniel said. I need 2. He left. Alone. Brom wanted to stop him. He didn't. Something in Daniel's face stopped him. Daniel was heading south, toward the trail the mercenaries would take. The only road from the southern cliffs to the center of the island, narrow, between 2 ridges of rock. Bones lay along the trail, just like everywhere else on the island. Daniel would stop, sit down, touch the skulls, read. A name, a name, a name. He wasn't absorbing. He wasn't building. He was doing something else. He was signing them. With seaweed resin. Black. Thick. Every skull along the trail received a name, in large letters, in the trade language, which every resident of Era Kiora could read. Haldi. Armorer. Mira. Midwife. Toba. Fisherman. Vilda. The blacksmith's wife. 42 skulls. 2 hours of work. His hands ached from the resin. His fingers were black. But every skull along the road now stared at the trail with empty eye sockets. And each one had a name on its forehead. Daniel returned to Oion. He told Brom, "Don't go out. Don't attack.
No matter what happens."
Brom clenched his teeth. "You're crazy," he said. Daniel replied, "Maybe." He left again. Alone, unarmed, with a notebook. He sat on a rock at the start of the trail. He waited. They appeared an hour later. 20 men in heavy armor, swords, crossbows, a ballista mounted on 2 wagon wheels. The commander in front, tall, a scar across his forehead, empty eyes, a professional. He saw Daniel on the rock. He stopped. The squad stopped behind him. The commander said, "Who are you?" Daniel replied, "Daniel Song. I live here." The commander looked at him, at his bare feet, at the notebook, at his fingers blackened with resin. He smirked. He said, "Get out of the way." Daniel didn't move. He said, "Follow the trail, but please, keep an eye out." The commander shook his head. The squad set off. Daniel stood up. He walked alongside them, not in front, not behind, but right next to the column. Like a tour guide. The first skull. Haldi, gunsmith, left-handed. One of the mercenaries glanced at it briefly, looked away. The second skull. Mira, midwife, 12 children. The third, the fourth, the fifth. The mercenaries walked on. They didn't stop, but they were looking. Mechanically, the names drew their gaze. White skulls with black letters. The 12th skull, a boy, 6 years old. Satan, exiled with his mother. His mother didn't survive. The boy didn't survive. One of the mercenaries in the middle of the column stumbled. He stopped. He read the name. He turned pale. Daniel saw it. He kept walking. The 18th skull, a woman. Areta, 31 years old, a seamstress from the port of Second Crown, exiled for having ties to a rebel. A mercenary at the rear of the column stopped, froze. He stood there, staring at the name. The column moved on. He stood there. The 23rd skull, a man. Dallin Recht, sergeant, 4th Crown, refused to obey an order. One of the mercenaries on the left stopped. He turned to Daniel. His face was pale. In a hoarse voice, he asked, "How do you know that name?" Daniel replied, "He told me." The mercenary looked at the skull, at the name, at Daniel. He asked, "Dallin Recht, sergeant of the Kiora garrison." Daniel nodded. The mercenary said, "That's my uncle. They took him away when I was 6. They said he died of a fever in prison." Daniel shook his head. "He didn't die of a fever. They dumped him here." He lived on the island for 3 years. He died from his wounds after an attack by the undead. He was defending the other exiles. Until the very end. The mercenary stood there, his jaw clenching. Then he slowly lowered his sword to the ground. The 30th skull. The 40th. By the end of the trail, 12 of the 20 mercenaries were still walking. 8 had stopped at various skulls. 8 had learned the names. Relatives, friends, neighbors, people they thought were dead, people they thought were forgotten. The commander reached the end of the trail. He turned around. He saw that half the squad was missing. His face contorted. He turned back. He walked back. Daniel was standing by the last skull. He was waiting. The commander approached. He grabbed Daniel by the throat, lifted him up. Daniel didn't resist. His feet left the ground. It was hard to breathe. The commander hissed, "What have you done?" Daniel rasped, "I showed them the truth." The commander squeezed tighter. Daniel felt his vision darken. Then the commander looked down, at the skull at his feet, at the name written in resin. Scylla Vorn, 10 years old. A girl, exiled for being born empty into the family of the third counselor. The commander froze. His fingers relaxed. Daniel fell onto the rocks. He coughed, gasping for air. The commander stood over him, stared at the small skull, mumbled, Scylla Vorn." Then he turned to Daniel. His voice was different, hoarse, quiet. He asked, "Is she here?" Daniel nodded. He rubbed his throat. He replied, "She's here." The commander dropped to his knees, not next to Daniel, next to the skull. He was silent for a long time. Then he said quietly, "My mother called me Marcus. Marcus Hale. She always said, 'Look for Scylla. Look for your sister.' I searched for 10 years. They told me she died of a fever." Daniel sat down. He looked at the big man kneeling before the small skull. He said, "She didn't die of a fever. She was abandoned on this island when she was 10. She lived here for 2 years. She hid in the eastern catacombs. She drew with charcoal on the walls. The drawings are still there. I've seen them. Marcus Hale, captain of the mercenaries, 35 years old, a man who had been killing for money for 10 years. He began to cry, not loudly, silently. Tears streamed down the scar on his forehead. He picked up the skull. Small. A child's. Intact. Neatly signed by Daniel's hand. He pressed it to his chest. Of the 20 mercenaries, 12 left. They ran back to the galley. They sailed away. 8 surrendered their weapons. They stayed. Marcus Hale was among them. He approached Daniel that evening. He stood there. He was silent. Then he said, 10 years. For 10 years I killed people for the money of those who exiled my sister here." Daniel replied, "You didn't know." Marcus shook his head. "That's no excuse." Daniel nodded. "No, it's no excuse. But you're here. You found her. You weren't too late, Marcus." Marcus looked at Oion, at the little houses made of bones, at the smoke rising from Selva's kitchen, at the 7 skeletal sentries, at the children sitting by the school and reading the names on the stones. "I need a job," he said. Daniel replied, "We don't have an army." Marcus said, "Then I'll be the first." The 9th month. Oion had grown. 40 people, 8 buildings, a wall around the perimeter, not a military one, symbolic, made of ribs and shoulder blades. Each bone is labeled, name, age, profession. Marcus built a real defense. 4 observation posts, shifts on duty, a stockpile of sharpened bone spears. The 8 former mercenaries who'd stayed with him were experienced fighters. Marcus put them through their paces every morning, training on the sand. Brom became his second in command. The 2 soldiers hit it off in a single day. Daniel watched. He didn't interfere. Military matters were Marcus's domain. Daniel had a different job. He reached the central burial mound, the highest point on the island. A hill 100 meters long, 50 wide, and 15 high. It wasn't made of stone. It was made of bones, compressed, fused together, and intertwined over the centuries. The mound was one enormous, massive burial site. Daniel stood at its base. He looked up. He felt a vibration, deep, powerful, like the rumble of a generator underground. There was something inside the mound, something ancient, something patient. It was waiting. He didn't climb inside. He didn't start digging. Instead, he sat down at the foot of the mound. He placed his palms on the ground. And he listened. For hours. Every evening. Week after week. The mound spoke. Not with words, with images, with fragments.
Daniel saw water,
The ocean. An ancient city on islands. Towers of white stone. Ships with sails made of something living. Drona rocks. An ancient kingdom that sank 500 years ago. He saw people. Mages. But not like those in the Seven Kingdoms. These mages didn't draw power from the dead. They spoke with the dead. As if with colleagues. As if with equals. Necromancers. That word was a curse in Era Kior. But what Daniel saw was not a curse. It was a culture. A civilization that built bridges between the living and the dead. Not slavery. Partnership. And he saw a woman. A young woman. With black hair. With the hands of an archivist. Slender. Precise. She stood in a vast hall filled with skulls. Each one labeled. Each one in its place. She was cataloging them. Not for war. For remembrance. She was the guardian of the dead. Like a librarian. Yeren. The name came from the depths of the burial mound. Warm. Sad. Ancient. Yeren. The archivist of Drona rocks. She had tried to stop something. Something that was turning the archive from a library into an arsenal. She had failed. She was exiled to Cordrain. 300 years ago, when the island wasn't yet a prison.
when it was just an island.
She died here, alone. But before she died, she did something impossible. She hit a call within her own skull, a spell that had spent 300 years searching across worlds for one specific person. A person who can read bones and counts the dead as people. Daniel took his hands off the ground. He sat in the darkness. 2 moons. A white one and a bone-white one. Yeren called to him, across worlds. 300 years later, she found him in the parking lot outside the coroner's lab when the knife pierced between his ribs. She pulled it out. She transported him. She cast him onto the field of bones. Not because he was strong, not because he was special, because he was the only one who did the same work she did. He read the dead. He returned names. He considered people those whom everyone else considered mere material. Daniel stood up. His legs were numb from sitting so long. He looked at the burial mound. He said quietly, "I'm here, Yeren. I've come. I'm sorry it took so long." The burial mound sighed. It wasn't the wind, not sand shifting. A sigh, as if something inside had loosened its grip for a second. He returned to the Oion. It was late.
Most were asleep.
Hannah was sitting by the infirmary, waiting. She saw him. She stood up. She walked over. She looked at his face. She didn't ask anything. She just walked beside him, to the warm room. They stopped at the entrance. Daniel said, "I know why I'm here." Hannah said, "I know what you know." He looked at her. She looked at him. Then Hannah reached out her hand. She touched his cheek with the backs of her fingers, as if she were checking a patient's temperature, but more slowly and more gently. Daniel froze. 10 seconds. 20. Then he leaned in and touched his forehead to hers. They stood like that, forehead to forehead, in the darkness, at the entrance to the House of Bones, in silence. It wasn't a kiss. It was a promise. The 11th month, with Park. They found her by accident. Marcus sent a patrol to the eastern catacombs. 3 fighters, reconnaissance. One of them noticed movement in a side tunnel. Not a skeleton, alive, small, quick. They reported to Marcus. Marcus reported to Daniel. Daniel went himself. He took a lamp. Mollusk fat in the shell. A dim, reddish light. He entered the tunnel. Sat down at the fork. Set down the lamp.
Took a piece of dried mollusk out of his pocket. Placed it on a rock 2 meters away from him. Walked back 5 steps. Sat down with his back to the wall. Waited. An hour. 2. At the 3rd hour, he heard a rustle. Soft footsteps. A hand darted out of the darkness, grabbed the mollusk, disappeared. Daniel didn't move. He did it again the next day, and the 3rd day too. On the 4th day, she came out. Small. Wiry. So dirty that the color of her skin was indistinguishable. Her hair was matted into a single clump. Her eyes glowed in the darkness like a beast's. In her hand was a sharpened bone fragment, a weapon. She stood at the edge of the light, looking at Daniel. He didn't move. He said quietly, "Hello, my name is Daniel." Silence. She didn't speak. She couldn't or wouldn't. Daniel said, "It's safe here. It's warm here. There's food." She stood there. For a minute. 5 minutes. Then she slowly sat down, crouching without letting go of the bone. Daniel placed a second piece of mollusk closer to her. She crawled over, took it, ate it, without taking her eyes off him. For a week, Daniel came to the catacombs every day. He sat down, placed food there, talked. Not to her, to the skeletons on the walls, as usual. In a quiet, monotonous voice, he called out names. He told her who they had been. She listened, a little closer every day. On the 8th day, she sat down 2 steps away. On the 10th, within arm's reach. On the 12th, Daniel held out his hand to her, palm up. She stared at his hand for a long time. Then she touched it with her fingertips and pulled her hand away, as if she'd been burned. But the next day she touched it again and didn't pull her hand away. On the 15th day, she spoke. One word. Horse. Sori. Her name. Sori Park. 19 years old, a former student of the Hunter clan, the Northern Mountains. The clan was slaughtered for impure blood. She survived because she'd gone out to check the traps that day. She returned to the ruins. They caught her a month later. She was exiled. She'd been on the island for 2 months, alone, in the catacombs. She ate shellfish and lichen. She didn't speak. She'd forgotten how. She thought she was the last of her kind. She thought that if she survived and laughed and someone took a liking to her, she'd be betraying those who had perished. Daniel listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer comfort. He just listened. Then he said, "Come with me. I'll show you something." She went, like a beast drawn to fire. From a distance. In circles. But she went. Daniel led her to Oion. 40 people. Selva was making soup. Real soup. Over the months, she'd perfected the recipe. The children were sitting by the school. Brom was repairing a wall. Hannah was bandaging someone's arm in the infirmary. Marcus was training fighters on the field. Oion was alive. Sori stood at the entrance. She watched. Daniel didn't rush her. He didn't call out to her. He simply went about his business. She stood there for 3 hours. Then she went inside. She sat down by the kitchen wall. Selva silently placed a bowl in front of her. Sori ate. Slowly. Tears fell into the soup. She didn't notice. A month later, Daniel found what he'd been looking for ever since the day he heard her story. In the far southern field. 6 skulls. With a distinctive tattoo. Thin lines carved into the temporal bone. A clan mark. The Northern Mountains. He didn't tell Sori. For 3 weeks he worked at night. He examined each of the 6 skulls. He reconstructed the faces. His method from a past life. Skull reconstruction. In Chicago, he'd used special clay and tissue depth markers. Here, he had clay from the shore and reed frames, and hands that remembered every millimeter of a human face. 6 clay faces. 6 names. He signed each one. One morning he approached Sori. He said, "Let's go." He led her to a small hut on the edge of the Oion. A secluded one. A quiet one. Inside, 6 faces stood on a stone. Clay faces. With closed eyes. With names. Sori froze in the doorway. Daniel said quietly, "I don't know which ones are yours, but they're here. They're from your clan. I found them in the field. They were lying next to each other. All 6 of them. I reconstructed their faces. From the bones." Sori entered, slowly. She approached the first face. She touched the clay. Her finger traced the cheekbone, the bridge of the nose. She recognized it. Daniel saw it. By the way her fingers trembled. By the way her breath caught. She had recognized someone. Sori screamed. For the first time in months. Not a word. A sound. Animalistic. Human. ancient. She fell to her knees before the clay faces and wept so hard that the walls shook. Daniel went out, closed the door behind him, sat outside, waited. She wept for 2 hours. Then she fell silent. Then she came out. Her face was wet. Her eyes were red, but different, alive. She looked at Daniel for a long time. Then she sat down next to him, close, shoulder to shoulder, and she said, "The fourth face, that's my teacher. He taught me how to shoot a bow. The fifth is his wife. She fed me when my mother was sick." Daniel listened. He wrote it down. "Sori," she said. For the first time in 2 months of silence, she was speaking and couldn't stop. Names, stories, details. Daniel wrote everything down, every word. By the time she fell silent, it was already dark. She asked quietly, "Why did you do that?" Daniel replied, "Because they deserved a face, and you deserve to see them one more time." The 13th month, the end of the first year, Oion had become a city, not a metaphor, a city. 60 residents, 12 buildings, a full-height perimeter wall, watchtowers, a well. Daniel found an underground spring using Tarn's skill. Horn dug for 3 weeks. The water was fresh, clean, cold. That changed everything. Lena's workshop was open every day. Lena O arrived in the 14th month, a mechanical engineer from the 5th Crown's airships, a woman in overalls. With a wrench, she'd managed to sneak in. Outspoken, straightforward. The first thing she said after climbing out of the sand following her fall. "Where can I fix something around here?" Marcus took her to Daniel. Daniel took her to the windmill, or rather, to what was supposed to be a windmill. A contraption made of bones, a fin, and sailcloth from a wrecked boat. It wasn't spinning. It was creaking. Daniel had been struggling with it for 2 weeks. Lena took a look, walked around it, said, "The angle of the blades is wrong. The bone bearing is cracking. The axle isn't centered. Everything's crooked." Daniel said, "I know. I'm a carpenter, not an engineer." Lena rolled up her sleeves, said, "Step back." In 3 days, she took the windmill apart and put it back together, correctly. The axle was made from a hollow tibia. The bearing consisted of 2 sanded-down patellas. The blades were made from shoulder blades at a 35-degree angle. The windmill started working. Water rose from the well through a system of reed pipes. Lena stood nearby. She listened to the blades turning. Her face looked strange. Not proud, sad. Daniel noticed. He asked, "What's wrong?" She said, "For 15 years, I've been fixing other people's things. Ships, engines, mechanisms. I'm the best engineer the 5th Crown has ever lost. And they know it." She fell silent. Daniel waited. Lena said, "But no one has ever fixed anything for me." She raised her right hand. Her fingers were crooked. Her joints were swollen. Chronic pain. 15 years of working with heavy tools. Daniel looked at her hand, at the angle of the deformity, at the placement of the calluses, at how she compensated for the pain with her grip. A professional eye, an anthropological one. He saw that hand as a skeleton. He understood every strain on every joint. He said, "Give me 2 days." For 2 days he worked in the workshop, alone. He locked the door, let no one in. He carved it out of a light, hollow bone, a handle, for her wrench, perfectly tailored to her grip, to her angle, to her calluses, to the size of her palm, to the length of her fingers, to that spot on her palm where the pain was strongest and where a soft indentation was needed. The handle weighed half as much as the old one. The center of gravity was shifted so that the load fell on the forearm muscles rather than the finger joints. He brought her the handle in the morning. He placed it next to the key. Lena looked at it. She picked it up. She turned it over in her hand. She inserted the key. She gripped it. The handle fit her hand like a glove. Lena stood there. She was silent. For a long time. Then she said quietly, "No one has ever made something just for me. Only I make things for others." Daniel said, "Now there is." She looked up. There was something in her eyes that Daniel had seen before. In Hannah, in Sori, in Everly. Recognition. For the first time in her life, someone had seen not a function but a person. Lena turned away. Quickly. Because she didn't know how to cry in front of others. The end of the first year. The first wedding was held in Oion. Tane, a former student and poet, and Dahlia from the 3rd group of exiles. They met on the island.
They fell in love quietly, without drama. It was just that one day Tane stopped falling asleep until he knew Dahlia was safe. As town elder, Daniel had to give a speech. According to local custom, he stood before everyone, 60 people, in the square made of skulls. He was silent for a long time. Then he took out a notebook. He said, "We have a tradition on our island that exists nowhere else. We call out names. So today I will name the woman in whose place this table stands, the table at which you will eat your first communal dinner." Her name was Mira. She was a midwife. She helped deliver 12 children who weren't her own. She had none of her own. Today she holds your table. Consider her to be with you at the wedding table. Silence. A second. 2. 3. Then Brahm stood up, followed by Horn, Selva, Pill, Nera, Marcus. Everyone. All of Ostion stood up, silently, in silence. Hannah stood to Daniel's left, Everly to his right. Sori sat on the floor at his feet, her legs crossed. Lena stood by the windmill. Sadie Brooks had arrived 3 weeks ago. A redhead, gentle, with a warm, low voice. A former temple archivist, keeper of names, exiled for preserving the names of the victims of a forgotten massacre. On the very first evening, Daniel sat down across from her. He opened his notebook. He said, "Sadie Brooks, 24 years old, archivist, exiled on the 9th day of the 8th month." He wrote it down. Her legs gave way. She sat down on a rock. She looked at his hand, at the notebook, at her name. Written down. Preserved. Who remembers the keepers of memory? Daniel remembers. He offered her the most important job at Ostion, to read aloud every morning the names of all those buried here, so they would not be forgotten. Sadie became the voice of the city. And now, at the wedding, after Daniel's speech, she began to sing, in a low, warm voice, a song without words, a melody older than all the crowns. Daniel stood there, listening. The entire Ostion stood around him. 60 people whom someone had cast aside, 60 names that someone had crossed out, all on their feet, all alive, all remembering. The 18th month, Archon Velen Merc arrived in person. 3 ships, airships, not a single galley full of mercenaries. 3 combat frigates of the Third Crown, the Inquisition, elite soldiers, 120 men. Marcus saw them at dawn. 3 dark silhouettes against the white moon, slow, heavy, their gun ports open. He ran to Daniel. His face was stony, his voice steady. He said, 3 frigates, the Inquisition. This isn't a mop-up operation. This is war. Daniel stood at the entrance to the workshop, a bone stylus in his hands. On the table behind him lay a book of names. Thick, heavy, 700 pages. He looked up at the sky. 3 dark dots, growing larger, drawing nearer. He said, "How much time?" Marcus replied, 4 hours until landing, maybe 5. They need to descend and pick a spot. The southern cliffs are the only place. Daniel nodded. All right. Gather everyone. The Ostion sprang to life as a single organism. 60 men. Everyone knew what to do. Marcus's training hadn't been in vain. Brahm took the northern wall. 8 fighters, spears, shields made of scapulae. Horn on the south wall. 6 men. Sharpened stakes driven into the sand in front of the wall. Sori with 5 archers on the eastern tower. Her bow was a masterpiece of engineering. Lena had spent 2 months making it. Bone shoulders, a bowstring made of braided tendons, a bow mechanism made from kneecaps. It had a range of 150 paces. Arrows with tips made from split femurs. Sori shot in silence, without any unnecessary movements. 3 arrows per minute. Every one hit the mark. She was no longer a wild beast from the catacombs. She was Ostion's best archer. Hana was preparing the infirmary. 2 tables, both made of bone. Instruments laid out in a row. Needles, clamps, splint plates, drainage tubes. All made of bone. All crafted by Daniel, to suit her hand. She moved calmly, methodically, as always. Her hands didn't tremble. They hadn't trembled in a long time. Two apprentices worked beside her, young exiles she'd been training for the past 6 months. Lena was reinforcing the walls. She was setting up struts made of fin bone. She was stretching ropes with shells attached at the entrances. Traps. Pits covered with reed mats. Stones on ropes that could be dropped from above. She worked in silence, intently. Daniel's bone-handled wrench never left her hand. Everly stood next to Daniel in the warm room. On the table in front of her lay copper plates, all 43 that they had found over the course of a year, deciphered, translated, categorized. Next to them was a separate stack, sheets of tanned leather. On each one, a name, a date, the circumstances, and the signature of the person who gave the order. 312 names, people whom Archon Merch personally signed off for exile to Core Drain. Everly said, "I checked 3 times. Every name, every signature. No mistakes." Daniel nodded. He picked up the stack. It was heavy. He looked at Everly. She was different. Not the girl in the tattered dress who had refused to eat from the communal pot. Her hands were calloused. Her hair was cut short. Her face was weather-beaten. And her eyes. Sharp, intelligent, angry. Not at Daniel. At those who had sent the 3 frigates. She said, "My father signed plates just like these. My family, my home, my blood. I won't forget this." Daniel looked at her. He said quietly, "You're not your father." Everly pressed her lips together. She replied, "No, I'm better." Sadie stood in the square. She sang out names. Not the morning roll call, something else. She sang slowly, deeply, each name like a note. 2,317 notes. The city listened. Even those preparing for battle paused for a second. They listened. And then they moved on, with something new in their eyes. Nira was sitting by the school. Next to her were Dovar, Tili, and Ren. 4 children. The oldest, Nira, was 15. They weren't hiding. Daniel approached. He looked at them. He wanted to tell them to go into the catacombs. Nira looked at him. She said, "We're staying." Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it. Nira said, "We'll be in the infirmary, handing out instruments, carrying water. We're not useless." Daniel looked at her, at the 12-year-old girl he'd met 3 years ago, who'd been sitting on the sand, staring into space, who'd said just one word, Nira. Now she's 15. Now she knows 400 names by heart. Now she's not the same person. He nodded. He said, "Listen to Hana. Do whatever she says." Nira nodded. She led the rest of them to the infirmary. 4 hours passed quickly. The frigates descended. They hovered over the southern cliffs. People poured out of them. They didn't fall. They rappelled down on ropes, in an orderly fashion, quickly, professionally. Heavy infantry first, shields, swords, chainmail. Behind them, crossbowmen. Light armor. Heavy crossbows with mechanical reloading. Behind them, inquisitors. Red robes. Black wooden staffs with skull-tipped pommels. Mages. Real ones. Resonators. They drew their power from the canvas, from the dead. Their strength lay in what Daniel lacked. He descended in the final wave from the central frigate. Velen Merch, Archon of the Third Crown. 62 years old, thin, short. A dark cloak over a simple suit. A delicate face. Intelligent. A former historian. The hands of a scholar, not a warrior. He didn't look like a villain. He looked like a university rector who had come for an inspection. Marcus watched from the watchtower. He reported, 120, maybe 130. Heavy infantry, 40. Crossbowmen, 30. Inquisitors, 8. The rest were support staff and officers, and him. Daniel asked. Him, Marcus nodded. A slender man, a dark cloak, unarmed, an Archon. Daniel said, "Good." Marcus looked at him. "What's good?" Daniel replied, "That he came in person. That means he's afraid." "Not us. He's afraid of what we know." The column set off down the trail, the very same one, where 7 months ago, Daniel had signed off on 42 skulls for the mercenaries. The skulls were still standing there. The names had faded from the rain. Daniel refreshed them every month.
but he didn't add to them. 42 skulls. Along the narrow trail between the rocky ridges, the column marched on. Past the skulls. The Inquisition soldiers were different. Not mercenaries, fanatics. Discipline, straight backs, empty faces. They didn't read the names. They marched on. First contact occurred at the northern wall. A vanguard of 20 infantrymen. Brom met them. Spears struck shields. A crash. A scream. Sand and dust. Brom was a rock. His 8 fighters were a rock. The wall of bones trembled from the blows but held firm. Lena had reinforced it properly. A volley of crossbow bolts. The bolts struck the wall. They pierced through in 2 places. Brom took a bolt in the shoulder. The left one. The non-dominant one. He pulled it out with his teeth. He kept going. Blood was flowing down his arm. He didn't notice. Sori was shooting from the tower. The first arrow hit the gap between the shield and the helmet. The foot soldier fell. The second arrow struck another in the leg. The third hit the crossbowman in the arm. She wasn't aiming for the heads. She wasn't aiming to kill. Daniel asked. She obeyed. A second assault, more intense. 30 men. Horn emerged from behind the south wall. He roared. The miners' fists crushed the shields like cardboard. 2 infantrymen were knocked backward. The rest retreated. Tane stood in the breach in the north wall, with a spear, thin, tall, a former poet. He'd learned to kill over the course of a year. He didn't want to. He learned, because he had to, because behind him was a school with 4 children. The third assault, the hardest. 50 men. The wall cracked in 3 places. Marcus darted between the breaches. His sword was everywhere. His voice was everywhere. Commands, orders, the names of the fighters. He knew every one of them, just as Daniel knew every bone. 2 hours, Oion held firm. But it wouldn't hold out much longer. Marcus knew it. Brom knew it. Everyone knew it. And then the Inquisitors stepped forward. 8 red robes. 8 staffs. They lined up. In front of the northern field, they closed their eyes. The staffs struck the ground. A red light, deep, pulsating. It flowed from the staffs into the ground, into the sand, into the bone. Marcus ran up to Daniel, blood on his face, his own and someone else's. He said, gasping for breath, "They're raising the dead. From the field. I saw it.
The skeletons are moving."
Daniel nodded. Calmly. Too calmly. Hannah saw that calmness. She recognized it. It was the calm of a surgeon before a life-or-death operation. Daniel walked out. From the warm room. Across the courtyard. Past the infirmary where Hannah was already treating the first wounded. Past Nira, who was running with water. Past Sadie, who was still singing. Quietly. Stubbornly. Name after name. To the central square. Made of skulls. The heart of Oion. Here he stopped. This was his place. He looked through the breach in the wall. The northern field. A red light pulsed beneath the ground. Skeletons began to stir. Arms emerged from the sand. Skulls turned. Jaws clicked. The army of the dead awoke. The very one for which Cordrain had served as a warehouse. For 1,000 years, the 7 crowns had been gathering these dead, sorting them, cataloging them. For this moment. For the moment when an unstoppable force would be needed. The Inquisitors pulled the threads of the canvas. The dead rose. 10, 20, 50. White figures against the backdrop of the dawn sky. Empty eye sockets, clacking teeth. They began to move. Toward Oion. The Brom on the wall turned white.
Horn clenched his fists.
Sori drew her bowstring taut. An arrow was useless against a skeleton. She knew that. But she held the bow. Because that was all she knew how to do. Daniel stood in the square, his back to his own people, facing the army of the dead. He looked at Everly. She was standing next to him, a stack of sheets in her hands, her fingers white. Daniel reached out. He said, "The plates." Everly handed him the stack. He took the top sheet, looked at it, took a deep breath, and began to speak. Loudly, calmly, as if giving a lecture, as if delivering a presentation to colleagues in the conference room of the Chicago coroner's office. Batch number 341. Category, skilled craftsman.
92 storage units. Date of receipt, the 14th year of the reign of Alton II. Author of the catalog entry, Count Kane. Third crown. Signature confirmed by his daughter, Everly Kane. The voice carried across the field, over the walls, over the soldiers' heads. The Inquisitors continued their work. The red light loomed. The skeletons marched on. Daniel continued. Batch number 218. Category: Infantry Soldiers. 107 storage units. Author of the catalog entry, the Office of Archon Velen Mirha. Personal signature, identified by the characteristic slant and manner of placing a dot above the Ket symbol. The skeletons marched on. 100 meters to the wall. 80. Daniel wasn't looking at them. He was looking through them, at the crowd of soldiers beyond the field, at the red robes, at the dark cloak in the center, at the slender man with the face of a scholar. Archon Velen Merc stood behind his army, hands behind his back, calm, watching. Daniel began to read the names. Not from the tablets, from memory. 312 names. He remembered every one. He read each one 10 times. He knew every story. Alton Vers, blacksmith, 34 years old, 2 children, exiled for refusing to forge weapons for the punitive squad. Exile order, signed by Velen Merc. Lee, Mira Solt, teacher, 27 years old, exiled for teaching children forbidden history. Order, signed by Velen. Keon Dar, boy, 11 years old, son of a rebel, exiled along with his father. His father did not survive the fall. The boy lived on the island for 4 months. Order, signed by Velen. Daniel's voice was even. No anger.
No drama, no tremor, facts.
Names, age, occupation, reason for exile, signature, one after another. Like lines in a report, like entries in a catalog. Only each entry was a person. 50 meters. The skeletons were approaching. 40 meters. 30. At the 20th name, one of Velen's lieutenants turned his head. Not toward the skeletons, toward Daniel. He was listening. At the 30th name, he paused. At the 40th, he lowered his sword. At the 47th, he threw it into the sand. The metal clanged. In the silence between the names, the sound was deafening. The skeletons reached the wall. 20 meters. 15. Brom gripped his spear. He prepared to die. At the 17th, 3 more soldiers lowered their weapons. At the 80th, one of the crossbowmen sat down on the ground. He set his crossbow aside. He covered his face with his hands. At the 100th name, the skeletons reached the wall. The first row. 10. 20. They stood before the breaches, 2 steps away from the living. Brom stared into empty eye sockets. The skeleton in front of him was a warrior, huge, with notches on his ribs, a swordsman. He stood there. He didn't attack. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring at Brom with empty eyes. Because this skeleton had been identified. Daniel had named him 3 months ago. Terran, a swordsman of the Second Crown, 41 years old, killed in a border skirmish. He left behind a wife and a son. Terran remembered his name and refused to go any further. The Inquisitors pressed in. The red light pulsed into the ground. Their staffs trembled. The skeletons stood. They did not move. One after another, they rose and froze. The named ones, the reed ones, alive in the only sense that mattered. They remembered who they were, and they would not go to kill. At the 120th name, a quarter of Velen's squad stood unarmed. At the 150th, one of the Inquisitors screamed. His staff snapped. He fell to his knees, blood from his nose. Too much resistance. The dead did not obey. 200 names. Daniel's voice grew hoarse, but he did not stop. He stood in a square of skulls, barefoot, in a plain shirt, with a notebook, and he read the names of people whom the slender man in the dark cloak had signed to death in neat, teacher-like handwriting. 250. Another Inquisitor fell. His staff went dark. 300. 305. 310. At the 312th name, Daniel fell silent. Silence. Absolute. Such silence occurs only when everything falls silent. Swords, screams, the wind. Even the waves near the shore seemed to have frozen. No ringing, no screeching, no red glow. The Inquisitors stood with their staffs extinguished, 3 on their knees, 1 unconscious. The soldiers stood unarmed. Swords and crossbows lay in the sand like toys. Skeletons stood in the field. 100. Motionless. Calm. Marked. Each in its place. Each with its own name. Velen Murch stood alone. In the midst of it all. Around him, silence and emptiness. The army he had brought with him was no longer an army. The army of the dead he had raised was no longer his army. He stood, slender, not young, with the hands of a historian, with the face of a scholar. And he looked at Daniel across 100 meters of sand and bones. Daniel looked at him. Then he spoke. His voice was hoarse, raspy, but every word was clear. Your handwriting is on the copper plates, Archon. I've been reading it every day for half a year. I know your slant, your way of placing periods,
Your habit of saving space and writing smaller toward the end of the line. When you ran out of space, you carried the last word over to the margins. You signed off on 312 people in neat, teacher-like handwriting. Among them were 16 children. The youngest was 4 years old. You recorded him as a storage unit, category 0, meaning unclassified. A 4-year-old boy, unknown, because he hadn't had time to become anyone yet. You didn't even give him a party number. He was listed on a separate line, a note in the margins in your handwriting. Miscellaneous material. Miscellaneous material. 4 years old. Velen Murch stood there. His face was changing, slowly, as if a mask were cracking. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it. No sound came out. For the first time in his life, the administrator heard his own records spoken aloud. Not numbers, not categories, not storage units, names, faces, ages, children. And he realized that every line he had written in neat handwriting at his polished desk in his warm office was a person, alive, with a name, with a mother, with a favorite toy, with a first word. He turned around, slowly, as if in a dream. He walked toward the ship. Alone. Not a single person followed him. Daniel stood in the square. He watched as a slender figure walked away across the field. His legs wouldn't hold him. The adrenaline was wearing off. His voice was hoarse. His hands were shaking. He sat down on a rock. Hannah was the first to approach. Silently. She sat down beside him, took his hand, just held it. Everly came over, sat down on the other side, shoulder to shoulder. Sori climbed down from the tower, ran over, fell down beside him, her head on his knee. Lena came over. She stood behind him. She placed her hand on his shoulder, silently. Sadie was the last to approach. She didn't sit down. She stood in front of him, and she began to sing. Softly. One name. Daniel Song. Forensic anthropologist, the one who reads bones. It's written down. He looked at her. His eyes were wet. He smiled. For the first time in 2 days. Marcus stood by the wall. He held his sister's skull. He watched the ships sail away. 3 dark silhouettes against the backdrop of the dawn sky. They grew smaller, disappeared, sailed away. Brahm approached Marcus. He stood beside him. He said, "They'll come back." Marcus nodded. "They'll come back, but not here. No one will ever return here." That evening, Oion gathered in the square, all 60 of them. The wounded sat, the rest stood. Everly brought copper plates. Daniel built a bonfire. The first large open bonfire in the square. All 112 names were written in charcoal on white cloth, strips of sailcloth from a wrecked boat. They were hoisted on poles around the fire, like flags. 312 white strips, with black names. They fluttered in the wind, rustled, as if the names were talking to one another. Hannah stood to Daniel's left, Everly to his right, Sori at his feet, with her legs crossed, a bow on her lap. Lena stood by the mechanism that raised the central pole. She'd made it herself, in 3 hours, from the wreckage. Sadie stood in front of the bonfire and sang. All 312 names, one by one, in a low, warm voice. Marcus stood slightly to the side. He was holding Sail's skull. He was looking at the fire. Daniel was silent for a long time. Then he spoke softly, addressing not the people, but the island, the bones, those lying in the ground, those standing in the field, those who had refused to kill today. "I am Daniel Song, a forensic anthropologist. I have come because for too long, no one has considered you human.
I will, name by name, until I reach the last one. Silence. The fire crackled. The wind rustled the strips of paper with the names. 2 moons, one white, one of bone. And somewhere beneath the central burial mound, where Yaren's skull lay, something smiled. Warmth. Tired. Grateful. 3 years. 1,095 days. Daniel counted. He always counted. It was the first thing he did in the morning. He opened his eyes. He looked at the ceiling of the warm room, at Vilda's ribs which held up the roof, at Toby's shoulder blade which formed the left slope, at Anish's vertebrae that ran along the ridge like beads. He remembered every bone, every name. Then he counted the day, 1,095, and he got up. Ostion stood on Cordrain like a city stands on its foundation, firmly, confidently, forever. 200 residents. Over the last year and a half, more exiles had arrived. The 7 Crowns continued to dump people. They didn't know what else to do. The machine was running. Bureaucracy doesn't know how to stop.
But now, every new exile didn't fall into the void. They fell into waiting arms. Marcus had set up a reception post on the southern cliffs. Nets made of ropes. Soft sand. Brahm's people below. Hana with a stretcher. Not a single one of the last 100 exiles had died from the fall. A city. A real city. Stone houses with bone frames. Roofs covered with reeds and clay. Wells. 3 of them. Daniel found each one using his Tarn skill. Horn dug. His hands knew no fatigue. Fresh water. Clean. Cold. Vegetable gardens on soil brought from the eastern caves. Selva grew something resembling cabbage. And something resembling potatoes. The seeds were brought by the second wave of the mop-up operation, in the bags of the soldiers who had surrendered. Workshops. Horn's blacksmith shop. A carpentry shop. A weaving shop where 3 women spun thread from plant fibers. A sewing shop. A pottery shop. The town was bustling. A school with 30 students. Nira taught the younger ones. She taught them just as Daniel had taught her, by skulls, by names. Every student knew at least 50 names by heart. That was the final exam. 50 names, with stories, with causes of death,
With the circumstances of their exile.
Ren knew 200. He was the best student. The boy who, 3 years ago, couldn't read. The boy who used to scream that he was useless. Now he was leading the junior group, patiently, calmly, just like Daniel. A 10-bed infirmary. Hana. 2 students who had become fully fledged doctors. Bone instruments, reed 4 stands. Hana had learned to make an antiseptic from minerals that Horn had found in the deep catacombs. The mortality rate from wounds had dropped to nearly 0. Lena's windmills. 3 of them. They spun day and night. They pumped water from the wells. They turned the millstones for the grain they began growing in the 2nd year. They provided light through a system of phosphorescent minerals. Lena never stopped. Something new every month. A water lift, a mechanical saw, a system of pipes for sewage. She worked for 18 hours a day. Every evening, Daniel checked to make sure she'd eaten and gone to bed. Lena would complain. She'd say she was a grown woman and would decide for herself when to sleep. Daniel would silently set a bowl of soup in front of her. Lena would complain some more. Then she'd eat.
Then she'd fall asleep at the table.
Daniel would cover her with a blanket. Every evening, the same routine. Everly, Ostion's chief archivist. She had her own room, a small one, crammed with tablets and records. She had deciphered everything. All 43 tablets, plus another 21 that were found in the 2nd year. The complete picture. 1,000 years of Cordrain's history. The names of the clients. The names of the contractors. The names of those who transported them. Those who sorted them. Those who kept the records. She compiled a chronology, tables, cross-references, all 7 crowns. All the ruling houses. All of them were involved. Not just one Velen, all of them. Everly worked calmly, methodically, without emotion. She had cried out her rage long ago. Now only precision remained. One evening she was sitting at the table. Daniel brought her tea. Real tea, made from dried leaves they'd found in the catacombs. The brew was weak, but it smelled right. Everly took the cup. She said without looking up, "You know, for the first time in my life, I feel at home." Daniel sat down across from her. He said, "This is home." She looked up.
There was something in her eyes he hadn't seen before. Not anger, not irony, not weariness. Tenderness. She said, "Home isn't walls. Home is when someone brings you tea and doesn't ask why you're crying at 3 in the morning." Daniel remained silent.
He knew she'd been crying. He knew why. Her father's handwriting on the copper plaques. Every new plaque she deciphered was another blow. She worked amid evidence of her own family's guilt. Every day. And she didn't stop. Because the truth is more important than blood. Sori. 3 years had changed her completely. The little wild girl from the catacombs had become Ostion's best tracker. She knew every trail, every tunnel, every crevice. She patrolled the island every day. Alone. With a bow. In silence. She'd return in the evening. She'd sit down next to Daniel. She wouldn't speak. She'd just be there. Sometimes she'd rest her head on his shoulder. Heavy. Tired. Trusting. Like an animal that had finally found its human. Every morning she'd go into the little hut on the edge of Ostion, where 6 clay faces stood. She would sit down. Silently. For a minute. Then she'd go out and head out on patrol. Sadie. The voice of Ostion.
Every morning in the square, 2,317 names.
Every day, without fail, even on the day of the battle, even when she was sick, even when she lost her voice and sang in a whisper for 2 weeks. She remembered everything, every name, every story. 5,000 songs and 2,317 dead. All in one mind. Daniel asked her once, "How do you do it?" She smiled. She said, "Every name is a note. I don't memorize them. I sing." He understood. She didn't keep a list. She kept a melody, an endless one, growing with every new name. The melody of Cordrain. Sadie was the first to call Daniel home, out loud, in front of everyone, at Ostion's 2nd anniversary. She stood up. She looked at him. She said, "You are my home, and I'm not ashamed." Silence. Then all of Ostion burst into applause. Daniel stood there. He didn't know what to do with his hands. He blushed. For the first time in 3 years on Cordrain, he blushed. At the end of the 2nd year, Daniel entered the central burial mound, with Hannah, with Everly, with a lantern. They dug for 3 days, Horn and 4 miners, a chamber inside, round, 10 meters, walls made of skulls,
Thousands of them, a mosaic of the dead.
and in the center, Yaren's skull, small, delicate, on a stone pedestal, with a copper plaque beside it, to whoever comes. "I'm sorry it's so far. Thank you for coming." Daniel read it for half an hour, his whole life, from the first day to the last, 32 years, 8 of them here, alone, among the bones. She did the same thing he did. She read, she signed, she named, with her hands, without his ability, just through stubbornness and memory. She dug this chamber herself, 8 years. She arranged the skulls, each by name. She created a call, a final spell, not from magic, from despair, out of hope, out of faith that someone would come. 300 years later, he came. Daniel didn't devour her skull. He didn't. She deserved peace, deserved to remain herself. He brought the skull out into the light, placed it in the square, on the central pillar, higher than all the rest. He signed it. Yaren, archivist of Dronarux, keeper of names, the one who called, the one who waited. Sadie approached. She touched the skull's forehead. She whispered, "Yaren," recorded. Then she looked at Daniel. She asked, "She's like me?" Daniel nodded.
She's like you.
Only no one recorded her. Now she's been recorded. By his 3rd year, Daniel understood everything. The system, completely. With Everly's help, with the catacombs' help, with Yaren's help. Cordrain was the rough draft archive of the 7 crowns. For 1,000 years, the ruling houses had dumped people here. Not random people, the chosen ones. Bearers of rare talents, descendants of dangerous bloodlines. Bodies with unique mutations. Masters, warriors, mages. All sorted, catalogued. The northern field, warriors. The western field, artisans. The eastern field, scholars. The catacombs, mages. All for a single purpose. One day, when the 7 crowns decide they need absolute power, they will raise Cordrain. All of it. All at once. 20,000 skeletons, hand-picked, obedient, nameless. An unstoppable army of the dead. Against their own peoples, in case of a rebellion, in case of a revolution, in case anyone says no. The tyrant's insurance policy. Recorded in neat, teacher-like handwriting on copper tablets. And over the course of 3 years, Daniel had named 2,317 out of 20,000.
Every named bone was removed from the system. Forever. Every name was a hole in the archive. Every signed skull was a soldier the crown would never be able to raise again. 11%. Not much, but a start. In his third year, Daniel made a decision. He couldn't name all 20,000. A lifetime wouldn't be enough. There wouldn't be enough time. But he didn't need to name them all. He needed to tell the story. To everyone. To show that the archive exists. To show who created it. To show why. And let the world decide for itself. He assembled a council. All the key people. Marcus, Brom, Hannah, Everly, Sori, Lena, Sadie, Horn, Tane, Nira, Pill, Selva. He said, "I'm leaving." Silence. Marcus asked, "Where?" Daniel replied, "To the mainland. To the 7 crowns." Brom asked, "With what army?" Daniel held up the book. Heavy, thick, 700 pages, tanned leather, bone binding, 2,317 names, with dates, professions, causes of death, circumstances of exile, signatures of those who ordered it, evidence. 3 years of work, he said, with this one. Marcus looked at the book, at Daniel. He nodded. He said, "I'm coming with you," Brom said. "Me too," Hannah said. "Me too." One by one. Everly, Sori, Lena, Sadie, everyone. Daniel shook his head. "Not everyone. Someone has to stay. Oion can't be empty." Crun, the old man, who said Dala's name every morning. He stood up. He said quietly, "I'll stay. I'll say the names. Every morning," Selva said. "I'll stay." "Someone has to feed these people," Horn said. "I'll stay." "My hands are needed here," Pill said. "I'll stay." "Someone has to carve the names." Tane opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Dahlia, his wife. She was pregnant, 2 months along, the first child born in Oion. Tane said, "I'm staying. I have someone to wait for and something to protect." Daniel nodded. He looked at Nira. She was sitting up straight, staring intently at him. He said, "Nira?" She replied, "I'm going." Daniel wanted to object. "She's 15. She's a child," Nira said. "You took me in when I was 12. You recorded my name as the first of the living. You taught me to read from the skulls. I know 400 names. I'm going." Daniel was silent. Hannah looked at him and nodded quietly. Daniel said, "All right." Lena had built the ship, in 2 months, from scratch, from wood washed ashore by storms. The keel was a single log. The frames were made from ribs. The planking was fitted so tightly that not even caulking was needed. The mast was a fin. The sail was made of sewn-together hides. Small, sturdy, for 10 people. Lena worked day and night. Daniel's handle never left her hand. She checked every knot in every joint 3 times. They named the ship Mira, in honor of the midwife who had hosted the wedding feast, who had helped bring 12 strangers' children into the world. She had none of her own. Daniel signed her name on the hull, in black resin, like skulls on the trail. The morning of departure, dawn, a pink sky. 2 moons were sinking below the horizon, one white, one bone-colored. All of Oion was on the shore, 200 people, in silence. Selva was crying, without holding back. Kroon stood tall, his back straight. His face was wet, but his voice was steady. He spoke the morning's name. Dale, a carpenter, 2 children, I remember. Horn stood like a rock, his hands clenched. Not out of anger, because he couldn't hug Daniel in front of everyone. He was too shy. Daniel walked over to him. He was the first to embrace him. Horn squeezed him so hard that his ribs cracked. Then he let go. He turned away. He wiped his eyes with his sleeve. Pill approached. He held out a stone, small, flat. Carved into it in small, neat handwriting were the words, "Daniel Song, T-Bone Reader, the one who came." Daniel took the stone. He put it in his pocket, next to the stub of a pencil that had been lying there ever since, from the very first day. Tane stood with Dahlia, holding her hand. He waved with his free hand. The children stood by the school, with Ren in front, a 10-year-old boy who once couldn't read. He raised his hand. He shouted, "We'll remember!" Daniel nodded. He shouted back, "I know." 10 people on board. Marcus at the helm, Brom at the bow, Hannah next to Daniel, Everly poring over the charts, Sori at the stern with a bow, Lena by the mast, Sadie on deck, and Nira, who sat down next to Daniel and opened the book. The first page, the first name, the ship set sail, the sail caught the wind. Mira set off, slowly, confidently. Lena knew what she was doing. Every frame, every plank. The ship was sturdy. Core drain was shrinking behind the stern, the island from which no one ever returned.
The windmills were spinning.
Smoke from Selva's kitchen rose into the pink sky. In the square, Yaren's skull gleamed white on the central pillar. 200 people stood on the shore. They watched him go. Kroon began to call out the names, quietly, one by one. Others joined in after him. 200 voices. 2,317 names. Daniel heard them. Across the distance. Through the wind. Through the sound of the waves. He heard them. Hana stood beside him, shoulder to shoulder, as always, 2 hands working as one. She said, "You're ready." Daniel looked at her, then at the book in Nira's hands, then at the horizon, toward the west, toward the mainland, toward Era Kior, toward the 7 crowns. He said, "No, but the book is ready, and that's more important." Everly approached, a map in her hands. The wind ruffled her hair, short, weather-beaten. She said, "They'll be afraid." Daniel shook his head. He said, "That's not what I want." Everly raised an eyebrow. "What then?" Daniel replied, "I want them to hear." Everly was silent for a moment. Then she said quietly, for the first time without irony, "They'll hear."
You whisper very loudly.
Sori was sitting at the stern, a bow on her lap. She looked back, toward the island, toward her home. Her first real home. Her lips moved. She was counting. 6 names. 6 clay faces in a small hut. She would see them again. She would return. She definitely would. Lena stood by the mast. She was checking the rigging, the knots, the ropes, the tension of the sail. Everything was perfect. A ship of her own making, of her mind, of her 15 years of experience. Her hands didn't ache. Daniel's hilt worked. She ran her finger along the bone, along the smooth, warm surface. She smiled. Marcus stood at the helm, broad, strong, a scar on his forehead, calm eyes. The helm in one hand, a small skull in the other. Sela Warren, his sister, 10 years old. He had found her, on an island from which no one returns. He was bringing her home. Not to her homeland, not to a grave. Home, with him, forever. Brahm stood at the bow, the wind in his face, his back straight. A former sergeant, a former exile. Now something else. Something for which there is no word yet. He had disobeyed the order to burn the village. He had been for it.
And here, he found a commander he wasn't ashamed to obey.
One who doesn't order villages to be burned. One who orders us to remember names. Sadie sat on the deck, her eyes closed. The sun on her face, the wind in her red hair. Her lips moved. She was counting the names. All 2,317 of them, one by one. She was preparing. Soon she would have to sing them to those who didn't want to hear them. Soon she would have to be the voice of the dead in the presence of the living. She wasn't afraid. She remembered that Daniel had written down her name on the first evening. Sadie Brooks, 24 years old, archivist, recorded. No one had forgotten the keeper of memories, and she would not forget anyone. Nira sat next to Daniel. The book was on her lap, open to the first page. Haldi, gunsmith, left-handed, fever. She ran her finger over the name, looked at Daniel, asked quietly, "Do you think they'll listen?" Daniel looked at her, at the 15-year-old girl who had been cast onto the island of death when she was 12, who hadn't cried, who had said just one word, Nira, who had learned to read from skulls, who knew 400 names by heart,
Who was now teaching others.
who was living proof that people shouldn't be written off. He said, "Not everyone, but some, and that's a start." Nira nodded. She turned the page. The second name, Mira, a midwife. 12 other people's children, none of her own. The ship was heading west, toward the mainland, toward the 7 crowns, toward a world that for 1,000 years had regarded the dead as raw material and the living as expendable resources. 10 people on board. 5 women whom this world had cast aside.
3 soldiers whom this world had broken, 1 girl whom this world had discarded, and 1 man whom this world had read, like a bone, layer by layer, crack after crack, name after name. They had no army. They had no magic. They had no noble blood or resonance with the canvas. They had a book, 2,317 names, and the silence of people who know exactly why they're sailing. Daniel Song, a forensic anthropologist from Chicago, 29 years old. No, 32. 3 years on Cordrain. A man who read bones, who restored names, who came to the island alone, barefoot, hungry, with wet eyes and a pencil stub in his pocket. And he built a city, not out of stone, not out of magic, out of memory, out of names, out of a stubborn, quiet belief that every person deserves to be read. He didn't want to be a king, didn't want to be a hero, didn't want to be an avenger. He wanted to be an archivist, the one after whom no one could be written off unnoticed. Revenge, as he understood it, was not blood. It was a card index. The horizon ahead grew dark. The mainland, the great land, the 7 crowns. Daniel opened the book to the last page. Blank. There was still plenty of room. Thousands of pages. Thousands of names. He took out his bone stylus. He wrote it down. Page 2318. Blank. The beginning. He closed the book. He raised his head. The wind blew in his face, salty, warm, smelling of the sea and a new world. Behind the stern, on the island of Cordrain, 200 people lived in a city of bones. The windmills spun. The soup was boiling. The children were reading the names. Kroon was speaking. Dal. Carpenter. 2 children. I remember. Tane held Dahlia's hand on his stomach. Ostion's first child. 7 more months. Horn stood by the forge. He struck the anvil with his hammer. The ringing of iron echoed across the island, like a bell. Pill carved a name into the stone, the 212th stone in his collection. Neatly, in fine detail, beautifully. And in the square, atop the central pillar, Yaren's skull gazed westward, with empty eye sockets, toward the departing ship, toward the man she had waited 300 years for, who had come, who had done everything she hadn't had time to do, and who was now sailing on, further than she could ever have dreamed, to read the whole world aloud, name by name, until he reached the very last one. Yaren's skull smiled, warm, tired, grateful. She had waited 300 years. He had come, and he would not stop.